Good morning. We'll call this meeting to order.
You weren't waiting for me.
Can we have everyone stand for a moment of reflection, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance after? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Could we get quick introductions going around the table, starting from my left?
Andy Allen, board member.
Alan Howard, board member.
Camille Lee Johnson, board member.
Lynn Rhodey, Office of General Counsel.
April Green, chairperson.
Aaron Zahn, CEO.
Fred Newbill, board member.
Is anyone on the line?
Kelly Flanagan, board member.
Do we have any board members online? Okay, let's move forward. Can we get a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
So
Today's agenda, I'm sorry.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All not in favor, speak now. So approved. Safety briefing by Mr. Zahn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Safety is a core value of ours. We spend each and every day thinking about how to be safe in all of the roles we have at JEA. We have a fairly crowded room today, so in the event of emergency, please identify the person to your right as your safety buddy. If you don't have anybody to your right, look right immediately behind you. In the event of emergency, may I have somebody in the audience that will call 911? John McCarthy, and someone that is CPR certified. Melissa Dykes, thank you very much. We will proceed in the event of emergency to the left of the elevators in an orderly fashion down the stairwell. Please use the handrail, and we will reconvene outside across the street of Church and Main. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Ms. Rhodey, could you do Sunshine Law and Public Record Statement?
This meeting is subject to Florida's government and the Sunshine Law, Section 286.011, Florida statutes, and shall be open to the public at all times.
Okay. Before we move forward with comments from the public, I just want everyone to know that we were reviewing several documents today. If you would like, they are located in the back of the room for those that are interested. All right, we have a few comments from the public today. Ms. Jennifer Stokes.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Jennifer Stokes. I'm an employee of JEA. I've been here 8.5 years. Additionally, I am a member of the Professional Employees Association, the union here that represents the engineers, IT, accounting, safety professionals, construction managers, and many other of the professionals we have in our midst here. I've been a union member as long as I have worked here. I've served as a representative, and I'm currently the vice president of the union, and I'm also the chair of the negotiations team for our upcoming contract renewal for the second time in a row. And I would just urge the board to keep our employees in mind as you go forward with your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stokes. Ms. Kathleen Crow.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the board. Thank you for this opportunity to address you this morning. My name is Kathleen Crow. I'm a laboratory scientist here at JEA. I am also the president of ASME Local 429. I like to call my union the melting pot because we represent over 22 different job titles from white collar to blue collar. My members are the first line of contact when a customer calls on the phone or comes into the customer care center downtown. Some of our members go out to the field and collect water samples to ensure water quality. Others handle the purchases of goods and services used by JEA. We also provide testing for both wastewater and drinking water to ensure safety, health, and environmental compliance. These are just a few examples of the jobs performed by ASME members on a daily basis. If any of the board members would like to discuss our contribution to JEA with me or my executive board, or would like to attend one of our general meetings, please just let me know. It would be good that when we get scenario number 3 today, that we don't vote on anything, we just marinate it on for a month or so, and then be more educated and not have to make a decision right now and see what best scenario we should go forward with. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. Ronnie Burris.
Good morning.
Good
My name
morning.
is Ronnie Burris, and I'm the business manager of Lyuna Local 630, and I represent the water and wastewater people. I represent the locates also of JEA. I'm a retiree of JEA. I've been around for a lot of years, and this is a very interesting time. I just would ask that when all these scenarios are put, that there's a lot of thought that goes into it, and that we protect our employees. We look at our employees, we protect them as the asset that they are, because they are assets. Without our employees, all of our employees, JEA wouldn't be here today. So I'm just asking that you take into consideration everything and take our employees and do whatever it takes to protect our employees. And we are prepared to help in any way as long as our employees are protected. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Mr. Jesse, and I'll ask you to pronounce your name because I don't want to mess it up.
Good morning, board members and guests. My name is Jesse Ferraccio. I'm the Vice President of International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 2358, as well as a lineman and a 10-and-a-half-year employee. Valerie Gutierrez, our business manager, sends her regards as she is attending personal business. We represent 543 JEA employees from about 50 different classifications, such as lineman electrical troubleshooters, power plant operators, meter specialists, meter techs, and inventory control techs, just to name a few. All these jobs primarily take care of our electrical systems on a daily basis. We advise our members to focus on safety and concentrate on their job, but it is extremely difficult after the last couple of board meetings focused on solutions that were not only detrimental to our members' livelihoods, but were completely lacking some hope at times. Our employees are always willing to make needed changes, as long as it is not at the cost of their pensions and or civil service rights, which is their livelihood and directly affects our community. We are losing some great employees now because of all this uncertainty and worry about whether or not they will have their jobs tomorrow. JEA has never in its history laid off a full-time employee, and let's not start now. Please do not let your future decisions about JEA's detriment affect these great employees or this great community. And as we've told Zahn and everybody before, we're more than willing to help in any way we can to secure our employees' futures, careers, pensions, and work together with JEA. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Randy Hilton.
Good morning, board members, Chair Green, and fellow board members, directors on. Today I come before you representing the PEA, which is Professional Employees Association. My name is Randy Hilton, and I am the elected and volunteer president of the PEA. I've served in this role for the past 8 years. My career at JEA started about 27 years ago. I've also served as a trustee on the pension board for 8 years, the city of Jacksonville. I served 9.5 years on JEA's internal retirement plan as a trustee, the 401A plan, the 457 plan. Very well versed in those rules and regulations and laws. I'm here today to represent the PEA. The PEA is an organized association of 300 professionals. We have a 16-member representative governing board that's elected by the membership. It's a large board. All the leaders, including myself and the PEA, are volunteers. We volunteer our time to do this. The association consists of about 100 engineers, 100 IT professionals, and we have like 100 others, which are analysts, environmental professionals, accountants, system operators, and safety professionals. The women and men of the PEA represent one of the most educated and experienced, and I would say dedicated group of professional employees per capita within the city of Jacksonville. We pride ourselves in that way. Our members represent some of the most prestigious universities in the United States and internationally. We're a very diversified group of people, as well as hold professional licensures and certifications. Many have advanced degrees and or multidisciplinary degrees. Several past JEA vice presidents, CEOs, managers, current managers, and directors have come from the ranks of the PEA. Although I'm not here today to talk about pay plans or pay-related issues, it is important to note that the PEA, we're individual contributors, and we are in a performance-based pay plan. It's not a step pay plan system. We earn our pay by our performance. Our job metrics are aligned to JEA's initiatives, and if we meet those metrics, we get paid on a performance rating scale that gives us what is like a grade in college. You get from a 70 to 100, and you get paid according on a sliding scale of performance pay. And that is our base pay plan, just to be clear. We're proud of our history of contributions here at JEA, and we look forward to many years of success going forward into the future. We thank you for your contributions as board members. I know it's difficult to be a board member. I've learned you only volunteer the first time, and after that, it's a job. But we thank you and appreciate everything that you do, and the opportunity to represent ourselves here today. And like my peer, Kathleen Crow, asked me if you have any questions. I'm available anytime. I'll be glad to speak with any of you about pension law or pension issues or anything related to employment or civil service. I know quite a bit about it, and I'd be glad to offer my services. Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. We would like to welcome our new appointed liaison from City Council, Councilmember Danny Beckton. Any comments?
Yes, please.
Come on up. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for recognizing me. First, I would like to say that it is a pleasure to have been appointed the council liaison to JEA. JEA is a valuable asset of our city, and it's my honor to have this responsibility and work with you to utilize my experiences as a business owner, the past 4 years on council, and having been an original member of the 2018 Special Committee on JEA that detailed JEA's value and impact within our community. I come to this role with a wealth of knowledge that I am looking forward to utilizing in working with the JEA board and with the entire team here at JEA. JEA is at a crossroads. Like many companies that we see in today's ever-changing world of technology advances and innovation, JEA is no different. Companies whose products have become affected by today's advances have to look to the future, consider change, and embrace new sources of revenue or suffer the consequences. It will no longer be acceptable, ignoring the facts and not considering bold alternatives that will be offered. As a policymaker and stakeholders, we must think outside the box and be prepared to explore these expanded benefits that JEA can feel to serve and provide within our community. It will only be together that we solve these issues, plan the future of this utility, and serve the needs of our community for years to come. For that, I am committed in helping in that endeavor, and I look forward to the opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All righty, any comments? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed, do the same. So moved. All righty, so next we're up on our monthly reports, monthly financials.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm going to guess that it's impossible to actually read the numbers that are up on the screen, so to follow along, I'm behind tab 3C of your agenda. As we round the corner toward the finish of this fiscal year, we're getting a better sense for where we will actually end up the fiscal year in terms of our goals and metrics for the year. I'll start by touching on our JEA Tower results, which are final for the year. In residential customer satisfaction, we finished in the first quartile. In overall customer satisfaction, we had a score of 757. That is the highest score we've ever achieved in the JEA Tower Residential Index, so we're very proud of that. We did set an extremely aggressive goal for ourselves this year, though, and so that score aligns with a meets standards, not an exceeds, since we did not finish in the top decile in residential customer satisfaction. We were ranked number 28 out of 142 national utilities in residential customer satisfaction. And we improved. We were in the second quartile as we ended fiscal year 2018. We improved to the first quartile in this year, primarily driven by improvements in customer perceptions of power quality and reliability and customer service. So good outcome for the year. We didn't quite exceed the goal for residential customer satisfaction. In business customer satisfaction, we finished in the second quartile in overall customer satisfaction, which means we did not meet our goal for this year. We had set a higher bar for ourselves. The good news of that result, though, is that while we didn't meet the goal for the year, we actually have a lot of positive momentum as we go into next year. The second half of FY19 results, we were number 3 in South mid-size region, and we were first quartile nationally. So we've got some good positive momentum again as we go into next year on customer satisfaction. Our transmission and distribution metrics continue to show outstanding reliability for customers. And as we get to the bottom of that first section on metrics, you'll see that red metric that's there around water distribution system pressure. That's just a reminder we're likely not going to make that metric for this year, and that's because we very carefully controlled for water pressure during that week of May where it was so hot and dry so that we could provide adequate fire protection to the community. In the next section, under financial value, we are continuing to work toward decreasing O&M spend for this year. We did again set a pretty aggressive goal for ourselves of 95% of budget on O&M. I don't believe we're going to meet that goal, but we are continuing to show positive progress in reducing the amount of O&M spend for this year. Under the community impact section, capital invested, we are on track in terms of capital spend to spend about $490 million this year, which is consistent with our capital execution plan. So capital execution is going very well. And I'll wrap up this report by just highlighting the second to last metric on this dashboard under environmental value, nitrogen to the river. It seems like I highlight that metric every month, but it's because the performance is so extraordinary in terms of nitrogen to the river. We have engaged employees that continue to implement process improvements that continue to reduce our impact on the environment. And so on a rolling 12-month basis, we've now posted the lowest nitrogen levels to the river that we've ever posted in the history of JEA. And that's with the population continuing to grow. So it's just an outstanding result in terms of operational metrics. Are there any questions on our dashboard?
Ms. Dykes, is there any way you could explain the importance of the nitrogen to the river? I think it's important that everyone understand the importance of it.
Sure. As we go through the wastewater treatment process, one of our primary resources that we use as a disposition of treated wastewater is into the St. Johns River. And so to minimize the impact on the environment, it's really important that we minimize the nutrients that are going into the St. Johns River. We have pretty sophisticated processes that we've put in place to be able to remove nutrients from that wastewater stream. Our permit limit, I believe, is 616 tons per year. And we're going to post a nitrogen discharge amount that's hundreds of tons below our permit limit. So it just goes to show how much, when you see employee creativity and ingenuity put to work, just how big an impact that you can make. And reducing those nutrients, again, improves the entire health of the St. Johns River.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's important for everyone to know. Any other questions from the board? Thank you, Ms. Dyke.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next we're going to move on to strategic planning. And we're going to begin walking through the scenarios. Mr. Zahn, you want to kick this off, or?
Sure. As a follow-up to the strategic planning process that the board has undertaken starting in January of 2019, the board had asked us some specific follow-ups from the June board meeting with regard to coming back with the implementation plan for a traditional utility response. Ms. Dykes will be prepared to present that. In addition, Mr. Howard, we have also completed the variance analyses that you have requested, and those will be contained in that presentation. After that, Mr. Vineyard will make a presentation on how we would, one plan on how we might approach dealing with the constraints facing JEA relative to our ability to grow. And then Mr. Wanamaker will present a scenario 3, which will be a non-traditional utility response. Ms. Dykes.
Thanks, Aaron. As Mr. Zahn mentioned, as a follow-up to last month's board presentation, we have divided the first section of this presentation into two. We'll first be talking about the sensitivity analysis around higher rates of distributed generation adoption, and then we'll follow that with an execution plan, an implementation plan for the traditional utility response. As a reminder of where we are in the process, we've been engaged in strategic planning, working closely with McKinsey on a scenario-based approach that aligns with the plan that was first presented well over a year ago. After developing our framework, our guiding principles, our metrics, we moved into the development of the baseline status quo, which was presented to the board in May, and developed the traditional utility response to that status quo scenario, which was presented in June. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'd like to ask Lynn to review the disclaimer.
The following financial projections are presented solely for JEA Board of Directors planning and action in connection with the development of a strategic plan. They are not a projection of future financial performance, and as such, should not be relied upon by present or prospective JEA bond investors to purchase or sell any security or to make an investment decision. The remainder of this disclaimer is in the board package.
Thanks, Lynn. To recap the Scenario 2 results, under our current business constraints, we're really limited to two primary levers, cost reduction and increasing rates. By implementing austere financial measures, including significant reductions in headcount, along with operating and capital expense reductions, we're able to reduce the electric rate increase that's needed to cover the cash gap in the status quo scenario from 52% down to 26%. The result of this scenario shifts some of that financial burden away from our customers and back to JEA, but it's at the expense of lower service quality and operational performance, as we reviewed last month. In the first section of this presentation, we will review what these results look like if we were to see higher rates of distributed generation adoption by our commercial and industrial customers, particularly in the early years of the projection period. Under the management response, there's still a cash gap of nearly $1 billion during the projection period. The cash gap is met with either a 26% rate increase or a smaller rate increase coupled with no city contributions after 2023. But that doesn't assume a substantial off-grid move by commercial and industrial customers. As we talked about last month, 7 of our 10 largest electric customers have publicly stated goals around sustainability. So for this sensitivity analysis, we compare the baseline adoption rates of distributed generation that were used in our status quo scenario to higher rates of adoption. Status quo included a 0.1% rate of DG adoption through 2026, which transitions to 1.25% thereafter, and that's after we reach an economic inflection point for distributed generation. For this sensitivity, we first look at doubling that relatively modest rate of adoption through 2026, and then we analyze what would happen if all 7 of our 10 largest customers would defect from the grid between now and 2025. As you can see in the results, because our baseline assumption for DG adoption was relatively modest, doubling of adoption increases the cash gap really only a small amount. If 7 of our 10 largest customers adopt 100% DG by 2025, however, the cash gap increase is much more substantial, and it results in a larger needed rate increase. It also likely further accelerates the adoption of DG into the future. At last month's meeting, the board also requested an execution and implementation plan for the traditional utility response. I will summarize that plan here, but I note there's substantially more detail on each step of this implementation plan that's attached in the appendix to your presentation. The implementation plan can largely be completed in the first 7 months, with a somewhat longer time frame for technology services to complete or divert their in-flight projects. Although some pieces might be completed more quickly, headcount reductions, for example, the plan is staged out to allow for the completion of work required for all 4 tracks of the implementation plan simultaneously, and it includes procedures for compliance with applicable collective bargaining and civil service requirements. Beginning with the workforce initiative, we would spend the first 3 months specifically identifying affected areas and employees in accordance with civil service rules and union contracts. The next months, month 4 through 6, include the placement process, termination notifications to employees, and transition support for those affected employees. And the personnel changes would be completed in month 7, including termination of our non-essential SLT members. On the non-labor O&M front, our first step is to recast our operational goals to set lower targets, and then to begin outreach with our external contractors. Months 2 and 3 filter these non-essential processes according to those lower targets, and month 4 finalizes our new processes and completes any applicable external contract renegotiations. Our capital budget would be rebuilt to meet lower established operational targets as well. Because this recast is already largely completed in the connection with the development of this scenario, the first month is reconfirming the reset of operational targets to align with the O&M reduction initiative. Month 2 will finalize that new CapEx plan with all the non-essential projects removed, and ongoing processes each year will reassess each year's capital spend to eliminate non-essential projects in line with our lower service targets. And finally, there are a few limited revenue generating opportunities that were included in the traditional utility response. These will be implemented over 4 months, which is a pretty aggressive implementation schedule, but is in line with the rest of the execution plan. In the first month, we will assign champions and identify any investment requirements associated with these opportunities. In months 2 and 3, we finalize detailed business plans, and in month 4, we start the implementation of each of these projects. On an ongoing basis, of course, we'll review and course correct as needed. The implementation plan slides, again, are simply a summary, and there is much more detail on each one of these stages that's provided in the appendix. Unfortunately, the traditional utility response doesn't fix the problem with the declining business. Although the austere response shifts some of the financial burden of the cash gap away from our customers, at the end of this period, JEA is still left with far too much debt for a business that's facing the external competition that we're expecting. Grid parity is expected to be a reality, giving customers an attractive economic alternative to JEA and leading to even faster declines in the business after 2030. Because we haven't changed the constraints we operate under today, we haven't created the opportunities that are needed to change the trajectory of the business, and our large debt burden will severely limit business flexibility into the future. This concludes the follow-up to the traditional utility response. Next, Herschel will present his team's findings on removing the constraints on our business.
Sure.
Madam Chair, could we pause for questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ms. Dykes, I had a few questions. One, and I apologize, maybe I'm just missing it, and I can't direct you to the slide number, but this, early in your presentation, slide with the SQ, traditional response prepares JEA for organized decline. 2030 SQ projection for total annual city contribution. Under status quo was 131 million by 2030, and then it was same as SQ with the managed decline. But then in the dramatic chart, it shows no city contribution after 2023 or 2026?
After 2023.
Yeah, what am I missing between those two slides?
The way to meet the cash gap is you essentially will have two choices. So what we've modeled as a base case is the continuation of the city contribution and the 26% rate increase that's needed to support that. There is an alternative choice of a lower required rate increase that gets rid of the city contribution, and that's really just a binary choice in the implementation of this plan.
Thank you. So we either raise rates or we give the city the money. It's one or the other.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I know that over the last 4 years of service on this board, I've seen a number of presentations on our IRPs and 10-year plans and historic projections. And it seems like I was consistently told that, yeah, we missed. Back in 2005, we thought it'd be this, and it really wasn't. In 2007, we were completely shocked when it continued to decline and didn't resume 3% average annual growth. I guess my question is, how confident can we be that the projections that we're looking at are really accurate? Because we seem to have missed, and the utility industry as a whole has missed in the past. I'm not picking on JEA management. But isn't it possible that rapid electrification of the U.S. vehicle fleet could save the American utility industry? No?
I think that's a great question. It's unlikely. And so a couple of comments. When you look at the forecast quality in the past, one of the most stark comparisons is the 2006 forecast that we put out, which was right after the Energy Policy Act was implemented, but before we really saw any effects from that act. And if you compare where we thought we were going to be under that forecast to where we ended up last year, there's about a 30% differential. It's gigantic. What you can definitively say about any forecast is it's wrong. It's going to be wrong in one direction or the other. As you noted, the entire industry missed the change. It missed the transformation that came along with technology innovation. I am proud of the fact that I think we got there before anybody else. But as a whole, the industry just missed the dramatic impact that this technology innovation would have on our business. To construct this forecast, we were very thoughtful and deliberate about how we went about doing it. We've got about 26 different variables that are inputs into this forecast that include projections of economic growth in our region, that include projections of electric vehicle adoption rates, that include projections of continued energy efficiency improvements. And we've got the best minds in the business that have been focused on making sure that each one of those variables best reflects what we expect for the future. Is it going to be 100% right? It's not. But this is our best guess in terms and our best projection of where this business is headed over the next 10 years.
Well, I appreciate you acknowledging that all forecasts are wrong. I agree with that statement. The question is really the magnitude, and let's not be 30% off again, either as a utility or as an industry. I guess my follow-up question is, and I was very impressed with the detail. I've been through this mammoth board book a couple of times in preparation for today's, I think, very important meeting, and I have no questions regarding the amount of work that you and your team have done. It's very impressive. I guess my follow-up question is, assuming this is our best guess of what the future might hold, are there any other triggers that could be pulled, in your opinion, under a traditional utility response to avoid the results that are included in your presentation? Do you feel like you've exhausted, to the best of your ability, those options available to you? And I acknowledge Mr. Vineyard's got a whole presentation on constraints, but without getting into removing constraints, you feel comfortable that you've given the board your team's best scenario for a traditional response?
I do, and there's a couple reasons why. One is we haven't ignored the revenue opportunities that can be done under our current constraints. Those are included in this response, and there's an implementation plan for those that are here. They're not enough to materially change the trajectory of the business, but they are included here. And so to ignore them would have ignored that potential lever that we can pull. Electrification programs, for example, are included in this response. We have been pursuing alternative revenue lines at least since our last round of strategic planning in 2012. And we have run into constraints for all of the ones that would have had a material impact on our business. And so given that body of experience, coupled with getting expertise from, again, the best experts in the business, with input into this response, I am comfortable that this maximizes the financial performance and the financial results that we're able to achieve under the constraints that we operate under today.
Well, that's the revenue side. On the expense side, are you comfortable that JEA is operating at or near peak efficiency? And are there other expense management tools that could be implemented other than immediately terminating 574 employees? I mean, we can defer STAR plan, or could we cancel the building? You know, or have we also explored those, and are you similarly comfortable on the expense side?
We engage in continuous improvement on the expense side, again, on an ongoing basis. I can't sit here and tell you there aren't opportunities. Of course there are. There always are. But what I can tell you is what the difficult part of this scenario is on the expense side, and it's because we're really getting into the world of trade-offs. We are accustomed as a leadership team and as a team of employees to providing excellence in everything we do for our customers. And under this scenario, the cost cuts are so deep and the personnel cuts are so deep that there's no way we could continue to provide that level of excellence to our community. So the hard conversation, should the board choose this path, is going to be around how we reset operational targets going forward to something that strives for less excellence.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
It's also important to point out that in the traditional utility response execution plan, there is the elimination of the building as part of that, as part of an initiative, as well as continued accelerated repayment of debt to eliminate the high fixed cost of the business and deferral of CapEx in order to try and generate as much cash in the near term. So many of the examples that you articulated are actually embedded in that strategy.
I appreciate that, Mr. Zahn, and thank you, Ms. Dykes. I don't mean to challenge. You guys have done thousands of hours of work and distilled this down into a 30-slide presentation with backup, which I appreciate. But I want the benefit. I want the board to have the benefit of that knowledge that you and your team have put into it as we deliberate over really historic decisions. I want to make sure that you're comfortable that this is your best analysis of a traditional response. So thank you. I didn't mean to criticize. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. I had a similar question in the same vein, but one of the examples that you gave is that if the top 7 commercial customers were defect from the grid, that comes across as a hypothetical. So, and what research have you done that's more solid that this is the direction in which the decline in the revenues will continue?
That the scenario that was presented where 7 out of our 10 customers effectively install enough distributed generation to not need us and providing central service anymore is a hypothetical scenario. It's a test, it's a sensitivity test on the otherwise baseline results that were presented. But it's based on those specific 7 customers having publicly stated sustainability goals. That's how that list was identified, is those customers have already come out publicly and talked about their sustainability goals. Coupled with research that through McKinsey is built into this scenario that says there is, our expectation is that we will get to grid parity for commercial customers somewhere in the mid-2020s to be able to install on-site distributed generation. And so the coupling of those two have led to that sensitivity analysis where we push on the decline in sales even more as a result of more C&I defection.
The other thing that Melissa and her team have done is we've actually gone out and talked to our customers. And one of the things that we have found is that many of our large commercial industrial clients are actively investing in energy efficiency, distributed generation, and IDR type technologies to the tune that have actually implemented in the last 10 years an average of about a 30% reduction per customer utilization. And they don't plan on stopping, so they have active development programs. And then I believe we've gone out and talked to almost 100 of our top customers and continue to see very similar programs internally as they find that it is a worthwhile utilization of their money to invest in energy and water systems behind the meter that are outside of their core business.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the board before we move on?
If I may, through the chair.
Melissa, in the past, when we have discussed alternative energy sources such as solar, there has been articulation to the board that battery systems aren't necessarily evolved to the stage where these customers can be completely independent, and that they will still have some need to be connected to our grid. And we've had a lot of discussions in the past around pricing and how do we allocate those fixed costs of them participating in our infrastructure. In this plan of the 7 of our 10 top customers leaving, can you talk the board through the macro level assumptions around what pricing assumptions have been made for their participation in fixed infrastructure?
Sure. So I'll pull apart that question into a couple of different buckets. I think it's important to touch on the residential opportunity and challenge with respect to distributed generation, and then on the commercial side somewhat separately. Your observation on batteries and the economics of battery storage is exactly right. I would add the word yet. Because as you look at the cost curve associated with solar, the cost curve associated with solar declined almost exponentially to levels that, frankly, no one expected 5 or 6 years ago today. It's part of the driver of the addition of the 250 megawatts of solar to our generation portfolio, because we're doing that at levels that are below our own fuel rate, which is economically outstanding. The battery cost curve is just in a different point on the curve, but is expected to undergo those same kinds of declines at that same kind of rate. So while you're not seeing widespread deployment of, especially in the residential sector, of batteries coupled with storage to lead to grid defection, we are expecting to see that sometime within the next 5 years. We are, however, seeing, in mid-February, we got our very first home that filed an interconnect application with us that has the ability to completely self-serve. So we have customers that are starting down that journey. We're really just in the early adopter phase on the residential side. One of the protections that we've looked at from a revenue stability perspective that you touched on is our demand rate pilot, which is going well in terms of our ability to deploy a rate that makes much more sense in terms of collecting revenue from customers in the same way that they incur costs associated with their connection to the grid. On the commercial side, it looks a little different because of scale. And also because of rate design. So when we talk about the innovative rate design on the residential side, it is innovative in the residential sector, but it's a rate design that's been in place for decades in the commercial sector. So there's already those price incentives that are built into the commercial sector around controlling for demand, which is where batteries come into play. And so as we look at the grid defection sensitivity, we built in that grid defection happening earlier than we frankly predict based on the cost curves. But the cost curves are only lagging that sensitivity by a few years. So it's a way to give the board some visibility into what might happen on a downside sales scenario. But our best guess, again, is built into the base case in terms of what we're going to see on commercial and industrial adoption in particular.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move forward.
Madam Chair, members of the board, Ms. Dykes just described to you the traditional utility response to the challenges facing our industry, and many of the items that she discussed are being discussed industry-wide, whether it be electrification, distributed generation, home maintenance services. What Ms. Rohde and I have done is explore what legal hurdles exist to pursuing several general business opportunities. What we've done is identify the legal hurdle that exists, the probability of removing that hurdle, and then the time and money that it would take to accomplish that goal. In other words, y'all seen the X-check memo on your screen before, several months before. How can we turn those X's into checks? And I'll give you my analysis based on 30 years of practicing law and 20 years in the government affairs space. One of the things that we've done is filtered each one of these opportunities through a maze of legal constraints: the Florida Constitution, Public Service Commission rules, statutes, charter, public policy. And what we found is, if you see green all the way across, we didn't identify a significant legal hurdle to entering into that business. But what you have, unfortunately, is a minefield of yellow and red codes, which means we did identify a significant legal barrier to pursuing the business opportunity. One of the overarching issues that will be a thread that runs through the entire analysis is what we call public policy. If JEA needs to change law to make it easier to compete for new lines of businesses, those elected officials and their constituents are certainly going to ask the question, do we want to expand the authority and scope of government, JEA, to enable it to better compete or to enable it to compete against the private sector companies already in that space? So it's an important public policy issue that goes far beyond whether an elected official likes and supports JEA, but that elected official is going to have to ask, do they want JEA competing against the private tax-paying businesses in his or her district? The second component of the public policy discussion is those private sector business owners aren't going to roll over and allow us to enter into a market in which they're competing. They're going to make their voices heard. They're going to go to the elected officials, city council, and the state legislature, and the mayor's office and say, why are you allowing government to compete against me? They'll have some help. I looked last week, and the state of Florida has 2,000 registered lobbyists. 74 are registered for electric generation and transmission issues. So if we need to make a state statutory change to give us an additional opportunity that might infringe upon another utilities business, I can assure you there'll be 74 lobbyists today watching everything we do. And if it impacts the financial capability of their clients, they'll be fighting us. There are 70 lobbyists registered for city council issues. And so any charter change we would propose to make, there are folks watching. The point is that the business owners that exist in an industry that we would like to compete in are going to make sure that their voices are heard. Pivoting to the laws that make it difficult for us to compete, we'll start with the Florida Constitution. The Florida Constitution, you'll see in Article 8, every action that we take must be for a municipal purpose. We partially are a creature of local government, and so that applies to us. The courts have interpreted the municipal purpose provision to be the health, morals, safety, or welfare of the municipality. It's a pretty low standard. It's lenient, but it's not trivial. It's not unlimited. Ms. Dykes and Mr. Howard were talking about the electrification opportunity. And industry-wide, they're talking about being able to have utilities sell, lease, or finance electric vehicles. Obviously, you put more electric vehicles on the road, they buy more of our product. I'm not aware of any court decision interpreting whether or not electric vehicles are a municipal purpose. But my 30 years of practicing law, I will tell you that I've got a very large concern whether or not government, local government, would be allowed under the Constitution to sell electric vehicles, or for that matter, lease or financing them. So we have a problem when we venture outside a traditional government or utility type of business. We've got a second constitutional constraint. There's a provision that prevents, quote, a joint owner with, it prevents government from being a, quote, joint owner with or lending credit to any private entity. It was inserted in our Constitution as a result of some activities in the late 1800s where municipalities, local governments, were investing in, partnering with, joint venturing with railroads. And the idea was the local government would invest in that railroad And the trade-off would be the railroad would then build a track through their community. And as luck would have it, many of the railroads went bankrupt, and it left the local governments high and dry. Some of the times they had to take care of the debt, but they certainly lost their investment. So that's why that provision is in there. The courts have determined the exceptions to this joint ownership provision. There must be a, quote, sufficiently strong public purpose, and the public interest must dominate the private gain. It's a very high bar. Unlike the other standard, this is a very high bar, difficult to overcome. As JEA looks into quickly expanding into new lines of business and new revenue opportunities, one of the normal ways that a corporation would do that was look to partner with or joint venture with one of those business entities that are already in that sector, and we could share revenue. As I look at this constitutional provision, that's a big hurdle that we would have to overcome. We're not going to be able to partner with an existing company, and so I think the constitutional provision in most cases forecloses that opportunity. When Ms. Rohde and I were doing some of the research on this, we found a Florida Supreme Court case that actually was looking at both the municipal purpose issue as well as the joint ownership issue. And this was a community in Florida, a city in Florida, that was proposed to partner with a privately owned golf course. And the deal was, the transaction that was explored was the golf course would get a rebate of all their taxes and fees that they would pay to the government. In exchange, the golf course would improve their golf course, and they would allow members of the public at a reasonable price to come and play on that course. And the court said, hey, this is probably a smart economic decision for that municipality. So it was a cost saver where they could provide recreational opportunities. But the court struck down that arrangement. And they said, if taxpayer money, I'll paraphrase, if taxpayer money can be diverted and used to finance a private golf course, why not take a further step and finance a private baseball team, a private juke? I didn't know that juke was something that courts talk about. Or set up a private drugstore or private automobile business. So if we get into the electric vehicle business, we'll see this Supreme Court case again, would be my guess. So as utilities think about partnering for electric opportunities, courts, I don't think, are going to roll over on these constitutional provisions. So how do we remove these two constitutional hurdles? Florida's Constitution has been amended 100 times in 50 years. You need time, you need a lot of money, and you need a compelling issue. And Ms. Rohde and I have identified two practical paths to do this. One is through a citizen petition initiative. And right now in Florida, you need about 800,000 registered voters in Florida to sign this petition. And there's a lengthy process from there. There's a signature validation process where you go through the various supervisors of elections throughout the state, the Secretary of State's involved, the Attorney General takes that proposed amendment to the Florida Supreme Court for review. There was actually a cottage industry established in Florida and other states for that matter, where there's these companies that collect signatures for purposes just like this. And the going rate for a signature was $5. And so if under today, it would be $4 million just for signature collection. But all that changed on July 1st. The legislature and the governor enacted a new law that makes it much more difficult to collect signatures. There's all sorts of registration requirements. And so the expectation is it will be more difficult to get the signatures and will be far more expensive. So while it may have cost $4 million prior to July 1 to get those signatures, it may be $6 or $8 million to gather those signatures. I think as y'all have seen in our recent constitutional amendments, there's typically a campaign associated with constitutional amendments that we'd have to do. And that may be $6, $8, $10 million to reach a statewide audience to convince voters that these two constitutional amendments would be necessary. And remember, each one of these amendments track along separately. You can't have them combined. So this would be two campaigns and two signature validation processes and two signature collection processes. So I could easily see that this process, if JEA could even use ratepayer dollars to do a constitutional campaign, it could easily be $25 million to pursue that. Just as a frame of reference, the Solar Choice Amendment, which failed, they spent $25 million. And the marijuana amendment passed, but they spent $12 million. 13. So if the board were to ask us to pursue removing this constitutional amendment hurdles, I think the very earliest that we could get it on the ballot would be November of 2022. And because of the time it takes to collect the signatures, it's probably beyond that. And we would need 60% of the voting public to approve that. There is an alternative path. The Florida legislature has the ability to put constitutional amendments on the ballot directly. They have their normal process, just like a new statute, where you need a bill sponsor, you go through various committees, and in this case, you would need 60% of both the Florida House and the Senate to vote for our two proposed constitutional amendments. As a data point, there have been 56 resolutions that were filed in the last 2 years in the Florida legislature to put amendments on the ballot, and not one got the necessary 60% to go on the ballot. So it's very difficult even through the legislative process. The rule of thumb is if you have a great idea, it's still going to take 2 legislative sessions at the minimum to get something through the Florida legislature. So we've evaluated, say it's 2 sessions, it would cost several $100,000 in lobbying fees for us to push this issue. And then just like the campaign process that we discussed when we were using the citizen initiative, it's going to be $8, $10, $12+ million times 2 to run these campaigns. So the 2 biggest hurdles I think that we have are constitutional. It's going to take at least 3 years, but it's going to be 5 to 7, if at all, to accomplish the goal. And honestly, I think our chances of being successful are slim. I don't envision the public crying out saying we need to expand the definition of public purpose, municipal purpose, to allow cities or municipal utilities to compete against private sector businesses. And similarly, I don't see the public crying out saying, look, we want to have government investing in companies so they can then compete against other private sector companies. So the third legal hurdle that Ms. Rohde and I have identified is a statutory one. As a government agency, we comply with public records laws. So if we start a new line of business, our competitors that are in the business already, the first thing they're going to do is file a public records request. They're going to ask for our cost data, our bid data, our business plan, everything that they would want to be able to gain an advantage over us that we've written down, we would have to provide to them. We were discussing around the office, it would be like a visiting NFL team would come to the Jacksonville Jaguars and say, we want your playbook. And all the plays you plan on the run, the scenario planning, your injury reports, and the Jaguars would have to give that. That's not a fair fight. And that's a statutory provision that I think JEA faces if we enter into an area that's not a traditional utility of electric, water, sewer. we're going to get those public records requests. So statutes can be amended, and there's actually been a number of exemptions to public records laws passed. And in fact, y'all know we were successful last year in getting an exemption to where we can protect for a period of time our sensitive customer data. And that was a great thing. As I mentioned to you on the constitutional process, if we were to pursue a public records exemption to allow us to protect our business plan and customer lists, et cetera, we need a bill sponsor, go through the committees. You need a majority of the House and Senate and the Florida governor to sign it. We'd spend several $100,000 lobbying it. As I mentioned, even with the good ideas, the rule of thumb is 2 years, so it'd take 2 years. And I think probably our chances of success is less than 20%. It's just my guess. I don't see that protecting business plans, customer lists from private sector competitors is near as a compelling issue as protecting sensitive customer data. The third area that we've identified as a hurdle to pursuing new businesses is Article 21 of our city charter. Article 21 is our primary governance document. JEA only has the authority spelled out in that charter. It grants us broad authority to own, manage, and operate a utilities system: electric, water, sewer, natural gas. One of the areas that utilities right now are utilizing to grow is they're expanding their territory. They're acquiring other utilities, entering into other relationships where they can expand their customer base beyond their core business. However, in our charter, our electric business is prohibited from providing that service to customers beyond Duval and the adjacent counties. Therefore, if JEA wanted to expand its electric service to another county, several counties away, it would require a charter change. JEA is also authorized to enter into certain utility-related types of businesses: energy conservation, HVAC work, research and development in electric and water. It's unclear, at least to me, whether that geographic limitation applies to those types of services, but if it does, then that will require a separate charter change. But remember, just like we discussed on the public records issue, all that would apply in this case as well. So we've got some very, very smart folks at JEA, and if we were pursuing a research and development opportunity and came up with a brand new widget, we could have a potential competitor before we got a copyright and such, do a public records request and get all that data. All that information is out there. We have miles of fiber that JEA owns, but our charter does not authorize us to be in the telecom business. We talked about the private business owners making their voices heard. I can assure you, if we sought a charter change, AT&T and Comcast would be across the hall, the street at City Hall, saying, why are we allowing government to compete against the private sector? So you can amend the city charter with 13 votes. And I think actually we can make some limited progress in getting the charter changed. The city council and the mayor's office have been very supportive of JEA. One of the things we'd have to do is to make sure that we could provide utility services beyond Duval and the adjacent counties, and probably we pursue opportunities that don't fit neatly within the utility box. And of course, we'd have to ask OGC to be involved with what we can and can't do on a very fact-specific basis. So I think we can, as I mentioned, make some improvements with our city charter. I put it at 50%. If we had 4 amendments that we were proposing, maybe we got 2 passed, and that might help some. They would hear from the business owners, as we discussed. I think it'd probably take a couple $100,000 in lobbying fees if we got serious about that. Bond covenants. If we start pursuing avenues or business opportunities beyond the traditional utility opportunities, we'd have to go and get our bond covenants amended. I think we can do that. We'd have to engage bond counsel. It would take a few months to do that, but I don't see that as being a significant legal hurdle in getting the approval from our bondholders. Similarly, if we venture too far away from our rate structure or the territory that we operate in, we may need PSC approval. They've developed a reputation of being very thorough but fair. I am confident that if we started stepping on the toes of other utilities, then they would certainly be at the PSC to make sure that their interests are protected. I think that could take multiple months. So if the board chooses for us to go through the traditional utility response, we ask that you also allow us, and there's, I think, a resolution, allow us to pursue the removal of these legal barriers. And in tracking along on this timeline, so as the traditional utility response would be being executed, we would then immediately start moving forward with the removal of the legal barriers. It will take, as I mentioned, it will take multiple years with limited success. So again, the provision we'd be working on would be the orange and the orange line. Also, if the board chooses this option, we would ask that you allow us to come back in a couple of months with a more granular strategy for pursuing the removal of these legal barriers. Finally, you ask us to explore any and all alternatives to grow the business and eliminate constraints, and Ryan is here to present another method.
Are there any questions before Ryan does his presentation? I have what you've presented is a huge and costly Herculean feat, it seems. So I would ask, have we researched other municipal utilities that have gone into a turned into a non-governmental entity?
They have, you mean as far as a municipal utility transforming itself, or just pursuing these opportunities?
Pursuing them
Yep.
and being successful or not being successful at it.
Certainly. We have not, and in part, that's because JEA is kind of on the forefront of this issue in this region. But we can certainly do that if the chair wishes.
I think it's going to be important for us to understand if that's the option, that is the path that is chosen, that we need to understand if what you've presented today almost seems impossible.
Madam Chair, with the exception of the Jacksonville City Charter, wouldn't we know if any other Florida utilities had attacked the constitutional and statutory prohibitions,
Good point.
public records?
Yes, sir. And as you know, I spent some time in Tallahassee, and I would.
We don't hold that against you.
Typically, we would be aware had there been a food fight between a municipal utility and other businesses, and I'm not aware of it, but I had not specifically done research as part of this project, but I'm not aware of any attempts by municipalities to change this definition.
Okay.
Well, if they tried, they weren't successful, because we've
wouldn't
still got the prohibitions.
Yeah, we would know. Okay. Any other questions from the board?
Sobering. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vineyard.
So at last month's board meeting, the board directed us to come back and detail how we can remove the constraints that are holding us back. As Herschel just discussed, the traditional path to removal of those constraints would continue to be a challenge, and success would depend on many individuals and institutions that are not connected with this community. But there is another way to remove these constraints. I would call it the growth response. And while it would still require a process with an uncertain outcome, it is a local process where we, as a community, get to decide the best path for our community utility so that it can continue to serve this community for generations to come. This is the non-traditional response. Why should we develop a non-traditional strategic plan? As we've discussed over these past several months, the industry is changing in non-traditional ways, and the way JEA approaches strategy needs to change in order to be successful. I want to level set for a moment and underscore that even though the industry is changing, what it means to be successful is unchanged. Throughout this entire strategic planning process, our strategic planning objectives have and will be unchanged. We're developing a 10-year strategic plan that increases the value of JEA now and in the future. These objectives include positioning JEA to succeed in the face of industry trends, proactively shape talent and culture, drive growth and value, identify and enable growth investments, and maintain affordability and reliability for our customers. And just as our objectives are unchanged, our measurement of success is unwavering. Every potential strategy discussed that has been discussed and will be discussed must be measured and evaluated against the 4 measures of value: customer value, financial value, community impact value, and environmental value. The traditional utility responses in scenarios 2A and 2B still lead to decreases in the 4 measures of value. Both of these responses only delay the inevitable and put JEA on a controlled path to shrink the business in order to cope with the outside competition for our services. The reason for this outcome becomes clear when we relook at the constraints through the lens of scenarios 2A and 2B. Critical constraints remain under both scenario 2A and 2B. So as a result, we find ourselves at a decision point for all members of the community, employees, board members, and elected officials. The question is whether JEA should be designed to shrink or to grow. As a governmental utility, we do have a choice to go in either direction. If we decide to shrink, we will stop planning and implement the traditional utility response, which you've just heard outlined today. If we decide to grow, we will continue strategic scenario planning and this process and look at non-traditional responses in order to address these constraints in the changing industry environment. This non-traditional response will look to address the root of the constraints. The root of the problem is not being community-owned. The problem is being government with government constraints in a competitive market. Government and the role of government is to provide services that no one else can provide. Governments are designed to not be able to compete. In that vein, with the non-traditional response rather, there are several additional scenarios that we would develop over the coming months. We would evaluate various recapitalization scenarios that would include the following. Scenario 3A is true community ownership. This scenario would look at giving ownership of JEA directly to customers instead of the government. Scenario 3B would be to evaluate an initial public offering. In this scenario, the city could convert JEA to a corporation and offer shares to the public in a new stock issuance. Under this scenario, we could provide an opportunity for direct community ownership by giving priority to JEA customers in the IPO. Imagine having a new S&P 500 company in Jacksonville. Right now, there are only 3. JEA could be the 4th under that scenario. Scenario 3C is a private placement. Under this scenario, JEA would be converted to a corporation, and we would recapitalize the business by offering equity to private sector investors. These may be many of the same investors that currently invest in our bonds. Under this scenario, we could potentially target specific pension funds, for example, that are connected to or have some connection to this community. These could include the city's pension fund, the state of Florida, or even IBEW or LIUNA, as well as infrastructure funds or other mutual funds. Scenario 3D and 3E are similar in some ways to a private placement, but we would look to strategically align with new market entrants who are looking to disrupt the utility business and the legacy business model. From a technology standpoint, imagine for a moment the possibility of partnering with a company like Amazon or Google or SoftBank to envision what a utility could look like. Or from an oil and gas standpoint, companies like Royal Dutch Shell or other energy companies who have expressed an interest in getting into the energy space. Finally, for scenario 3F, we would evaluate JEA being converted to an investor-owned utility through a strategic investor such as NextEra, Duke, or Emera purchasing a controlling interest. And while we have not evaluated any of these scenarios yet, the reason that we are introducing these concepts today is because we are responding to the board's request to discuss any and all possible ways to remove the constraints. And we can say that these scenarios would address the constraints and allow us to grow. If the board chooses to explore these scenarios, it would take roughly a year to evaluate and develop a path forward. The first and most important action that we would take is to protect our employees' future. You heard from the union leaders this morning. We know that these scenarios and the open process that we have been operating under has the potential to be very distracting for employees. And we need to make sure that they understand what we are prepared to do for them so that they can continue to perform with world-class operational excellence in everything they do. To that end, we have prepared all necessary documents and are ready to send a letter to all employees this afternoon, which would outline all proposed employee protection programs subject to collective bargaining. We would then launch a methodical, open, and competitive solicitation process to invite all potential suitors, including financial, technology, energy and water companies, to propose solutions under any of the possible scenarios outlined. We would work with bankers and advisors through February of next year to present recommendations to the board for how to achieve the maximum value for employees, customers, and the community. We will be providing regular updates to the board during that time period. There's a lot of work to evaluate these scenarios, and we have to run a process because we have to get all of the information before we can have a comprehensive conversation. Once we have all of the information, we will be able to have a conversation as a community around these scenarios. This will start with the JEA board having the opportunity to discuss and vote on whether to approve any recommendation, and then send that recommendation to City Council for for review and contemplation. And then finally, we recognize that as a community utility, all members of the community have to have a final say on any recommendation. So in the event the City Council approves the recommendation every member of our community would have a voice in the final approval through a vote on the board and city council approved recommendation. We understand the dynamics of this conversation. If the board chooses to evaluate these scenarios, there are two critical items we need to get right up front. I already touched on the first one. We need to protect employees, all employees. Second, we need to set a high bar for any decision of this magnitude to ensure that we remain true to our vision to improve lives in Northeast Florida and to increase all four measures of value. We need to ensure that any recapitalization scenario will achieve our vision, mission, and values as an organization. So to that end, we recommend the board approve a set of minimum requirements that must be achieved in relation to each of the four measures of value. These minimum requirements would be table stakes for any possible recommendation that is a result of any recapitalization analyses that we undertake. And it would ensure that we achieve our vision to improve lives in Northeast Florida. And I'll walk through each of those. For financial value, under the status quo, the present value of JEA's city contribution is a little less than $2 billion. We recommend that any recapitalization must result in more than $3 billion to the city. For customer value, under the status quo, customers do not get any distributions and see a significant rate increase over the next several years. We recommend that any recapitalization must benefit all members of the community who have helped us be successful for over a century. To that end, we recommend that any recapitalization result in more than $400 million in direct customer rebates. This would be $350 per account. So a typical household that has electric, water, sewer, and irrigation service would receive at least $1,400 directly as a result of any transaction. We would also recommend that any recapitalization result in at least 3 years of contractually guaranteed rate stability. On environmental value, under the status quo, there is no funding for renewable energy requirements or alternative water supply sources. We recommend that any recapitalization have a commitment to fund and provide the City of Jacksonville and Duval County Public Schools with 100% renewable energy by 2030, and have a commitment to fund and provide 40 million gallons per day of alternative water capacity in Northeast Florida by 2035. Finally, on community impact value. Under the status quo, employees have no employment guarantees and will be forced to terminate nearly 600 employees who will no longer be able to participate in the pension. We will not be providing any retention program and will leave downtown for cheaper existing office space. We recommend that any recapitalization include protection for certain employee retirement benefits, guarantee employee compensation and benefits for at least 3 years, provide retention payments of 100% of their current base salary to all full-time employees, and include a commitment to keep a new headquarters and employees in downtown Jacksonville, contributing to the economic development of the community. I know this is a lot to take in, but when you look at what I just laid out, I think it becomes clear that any recapitalization scenario that hits these minimum table stakes will truly be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to improve the lives of every single resident and business of Northeast Florida. No one will be left behind. Remember, I said there are two critical items that we need to get right today. And I cannot underscore this enough. There are a lot of employees watching. Protecting employees today is especially critical to this discussion, to starting this discussion. And we have Kevin Hyde from Foley and Lardner here to talk a little bit more about what that means.
Thanks, Ryan. And Madam Chair, thank you for allowing me to appear before you and the board today. Mr. Wanamaker has already indicated to you the importance of protecting employee pensions, and the speakers that you had in public comment very appropriately recognize that point as well. What I'm going to discuss with you today is, I believe, protection that does exactly that. And the thing that I would like to put into your mind as we begin this, what will I think be a fairly brief discussion, is the point of the recommendation that Mr. Wanamaker and the team is making is to protect the value of pensions that employees have earned through today. And I want to underscore that it is protecting the value of the pensions that they have already earned to ensure that they are always going to be there. As Mr. Wanamaker and the entire team has already recognized, and I know you have acknowledged, employees are the number one asset of JEA. And many times employees make a decision to work in JEA or otherwise city government because of the possibility of a secure retirement. It's something that we all think about. And that's what this is designed to do. It is often misunderstood when we hear about government employees, in this case JEA employees, receiving a pension. They think, well, they're getting something in addition to what I may be getting if I work in the private sector. But understand, as government employees, most JEA employees, while they are in a defined pension plan, they do not pay into Social Security or have any other additional retirement benefit. So this is the stake upon which they rely and for which they have worked. And we understand in the event of a recapitalization event, it would automatically terminate that plan. And so the point of what I'm going to discuss is to make sure that the benefits which have been earned to date are protected in the most secure way possible. And obviously, we all individually, and certainly the JEA employees, want to have a strong insurance at the nest egg for which they have worked. This is a benefit, but it is not a gift. It is something for which these employees have worked very hard and devoted their professional lives to. And the point of this is to protect that nest egg. So how is this going to work? And over on the far right-hand column, very briefly, the idea is to make sure all employees are certainly becoming vested into the plan or vested into the retirement benefit. So how is that going to work? Very briefly, that employees will be given increased years of service credit to advance them to the next retirement milestone in the plan if they are currently vested in the plan. And if they are not currently invested in the plan, meaning that they are under 5 years of service, they will be given years of service such that they would then become a vested member. The idea is to protect those who are currently vested members and move them to the next retirement milestone. And in the case of someone who has not yet have that level of seniority, to move them to the point of being vested. That, as Mr. Wanamaker has suggested, is the protection that is so necessary and that is discovered here. The next graph here is a bit busy, but what it is designed to do is to show you that under the two applicable retirement plans exactly where employees fall based on the numbers of years of service that they have and relative to their age. And you have this in your materials. You can go over it more at your leisure. But one of the things that also the proposal would allow to do is that currently an employee that's in the general employee defined contribution plan who has more than 5 years of service can make a personal decision as to whether they want to go back into the general employment plan, the defined benefit plan. And they are allowed to do that one time as a transaction would to occur. Those who are currently in the plan but who were hired before October 1 but have under 5 years of service may decide that what they want to do is to take their contributions back and receive an equal amount of their contributions, again, because they would perhaps have longer to work in their time. The idea, again, is to protect those benefits which have been earned and give a path forward. So let's talk about two scenarios. And this is only two brief scenarios of many, and it is going to be individualized to each employee. And from what I've been told, the senior leadership team is going to be providing very specific individualized information about what would occur to each employee as employees assess this. So again, what is our operating principle? It is to protect the value of the pensions that they have earned today. So as we look at these two examples, you might see that there's going to have, on first glance, appear to be some inequity in terms of the acceleration of years of service and what it means. But understand that these two employees come at their pensions at different points in their lives. One employee being relatively new in the years of service, the other much closer to one of the milestones for retirement. One of the great providers here to making sure that these benefits are going to be protected in both situations is time on the left-hand side, in example number one, that being time for inflation to take care of and provide for additional benefits. Whereas in the case of the second example of employee much closer to retirement, he's going to be able to actually move into the cost of living adjustments and get benefits of that once he actually starts drawing the retention benefits. And mathematically, while I walk through these, you may say one employee is getting more than the other. It's actually the employee on the left who's going to receive the greater amount of dollars because of the difference between inflation and the cost of living adjustments. I bring this up for this reason. There are 2,000 employees, as I understand, and in unique circumstances, an example, in working with the actuary, models have been run to make sure, to the extent humanly possible, the employees are protected in the best way, and that JEA is willing to make the investment necessary to provide the assurance to these employees that the nest egg is being protected. So let's look at these examples. We just use Caitlin, profile example number one. She is 26 years old. She currently has 6 years of service, and she is going to draw her pension, i.e. start receiving the benefits from that in 24 years. So what does she receive under this proposal? She would receive 24 additional years of service credit on top of the 6 years that she already has. Why does she get the 24 years? Because it moves her to the retirement milestone of 30 years. It doesn't mean she automatically starts drawing the benefit. She still has to meet the age requirement. But through the value of time and overinflation, her participation in the plan as it currently exists today is wrapped tight, it's secure, and when she reaches that milestone in her life at age 50 in this situation, she's going to be able to receive benefits that have been protected over the course of that time. You'll see here the concept of granting additional years of service credit is a driver of that. And as part of the recapitalization event, JEA would be paying into the system for those accelerated years, my term, accelerated years, such that we know it's not an unfunded liability, it's actually been paid for in the plan. And that's very important to get back to Mr. Wanamaker's point of protecting the benefits. Our second scenario is an individual who is much closer to retirement when we think about one of the milestones of JEA service being someone who has reached age 55 and 20 years of service is eligible to retire if he or she chooses to. So he is 53 years old with 18 years of service. In both of those scenarios, he's 2 years away from reaching the next available milestone. 2 years away from being 55, 2 years away from having the 20 years of service. He is eligible to receive those retirement benefits in 2 years, actually drawing down the money. So what would he receive under this event? He would get 2 years of additional service, thus moving him from 18 to 20, a retirement milestone. And then he will, when he reaches age 55, he would then be able to start drawing that benefit down. And so what we see here is that he is accelerating more quickly up to that milestone through the years of service. And as we've talked about, he's going to have the benefit then when he starts receiving his defined pension benefits, the cost of living adjustment that's going to go along with this. As I indicated, that there is multiple scenarios, and as I've reviewed them, I know the team has looked at, the actuary has looked at many of these scenarios to make sure that they are protected. But the basic concept is what Mr. Wanamaker began with. It is to protect the employee's future, and from what I've been talking about, specifically that retirement piece, as you heard from our speakers earlier, that is so important to them. And it is done by giving these additional years of service credit, moving them to that next retirement milestone, and making sure that they are protected after the recapitalization event. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hyde?
So to wrap up, should the Board of Directors decide to proceed in authorizing management on the resolutions around proceeding on scenario 3, I think there's 3 major stakeholder groups that we need to make sure we pay specific care to. As the union leaders clearly articulated, and I couldn't agree even more, our employees are our number one asset to take care of our customers. To that end, the recommendations around the pension acceleration, the retention, and the guarantee of 3 years compensation of benefits post-transaction would be a recommendation for consideration. The second is our customers and our community. Let's not forget that while we are exploring all the potential future possibilities for JEA, we have a community that wants some level of stability. And what we would recommend would be a base rate freeze during the time of a competitive process, and that is for the board's consideration. The last is a commitment to an open and competitive process. I think you heard Mr. Wanamaker talk about how we would have a commitment to being open and bringing back to this board and the community over the next series of 9 months to 12 months information as we collect it and go through this process. And the last is our investors who have been supporters of JEA for a number of years, is a commitment that this management team and board will remain committed to the operational and financial excellence that they've come to expect from us. I think the STAR plan from last year is a clear demonstration of that. You can see our operational metrics actually are at an all-time high relative to a lot of the industry metrics as well as customer satisfaction. And we would remain committed to that as a management team throughout this process. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Ms. Rohde, as I believe there are a series of resolutions depending upon which way the board decides to go in the decision of whether to design the JEA to shrink or to grow.
Madam Chair, should the board decide to pursue scenario 2, the chair may solicit a motion directing JEA management to pursue scenario 2A, the traditional utility response, or scenario 2B, the traditional utility response plus pursuit of a traditional legislative approach to reducing legal constraints to pursuit of revenue initiatives. The chair additionally would solicit a motion to adopt the following resolution pertaining to pursuit of scenario 2. And that is resolution 2019-06. I'll read that for the board. (2019-06), a resolution approving employee terminations and CEO and non-CEO executive employment agreements under scenario 2, the traditional utility response, and authorizing the board or CEO, as applicable, to take any and all action to effect those agreements. Whereas the board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to terminate the employment of and enter into separation agreements with 574 JEA employees, the impacted employees, in connection with scenario 2, the traditional utility response. Whereas the board has reviewed the layoff notification letters for civil service and appointed employees attached here 2 as Exhibit 1, the employee layoff notification letters. Whereas the board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to retain the talent necessary to effectively implement scenario 2, the traditional utility response, and enter into employment agreements with employees of JEA that have a title of vice president or higher. And whereas the board has reviewed the employment agreement with JEA's Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director, the CEO employment agreement, attached here 2 as Exhibit 2, and the employment agreement with JEA's senior executive management team other than the CEO, in substantially the form attached here 2 as Exhibit 3, the form non-CEO executive employment agreement. Be it resolved by the board that, number 1, the CEO or his designee shall have authority to terminate the employment of the impacted employees on the terms and conditions set forth in the employee layoff notification letters. In consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the employee layoff notification letters, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the employee layoff notification letters, and take or cause to be taken any and all action, and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered any and all documents that the CEO or his designee deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. Number 2, The board hereby approves the CEO employment agreement and form non-CEO executive employment agreement. Number 3, the chair of the board shall have the authority to execute the CEO employment agreement. In consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the CEO employment agreement, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the CEO employment agreement, and take or cause to be taken any and all action, and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered any and all documents that the chair of the board deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. 4, the CEO or his designee shall have the authority to execute the non-CEO executive employment agreements in substantially the same form as the form non-CEO executive employment agreement. In consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the non-CEO executive employment agreements, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the non-CEO executive employment agreement, and take or cause to be taken any and all action, and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered any and all documents that the CEO or his designee deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. This resolution shall be effective immediately upon its adoption. Should the board decide to pursue scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response, the chair may solicit a motion to adopt resolutions 201907, 201908, and 201909. At the chair's pleasure, I'll read those as well. Yes, please. Resolution 201907. A resolution authorizing the CEO to take any and all action to investigate and pursue scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response. Whereas the board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to investigate and pursue scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response, as presented to the board at the July 23rd, 2019 JEA board meeting. Be it resolved by the board that, number 1, the board authorizes the chief executive officer and managing director, the CEO, or his designee to take any and all action to maximize the 4 core values of JEA of customer, community, environmental, and financial through a competitive solicitation process regarding JEA assets, including but not limited to issuance of a competitive solicitation instrument, including but not limited to an invitation to negotiate, engaging in and undertaking a competitive solicitation process, and engaging accountants, consultants, financial advisors, and legal counsel to assist in a competitive solicitation process. Number 2, for purposes of developing an invitation to negotiate or other competitive solicitation instrument, any competitive solicitation outcome must achieve the following. Any final outcome is subject to additional board action and other approvals as set forth in federal, state, and local law. Greater than $3 billion of value to the city of Jacksonville. Greater than $400 million of value distributed to customers. At least 3 years of contractually guaranteed base rate stability for customers. Commitment to fund and provide the City of Jacksonville and the Duval County Public School System with 100% renewable electricity by the year 2030. Commitment to fund and provide 40 million gallons per day of alternative water capacity for Northeast Florida by the year 2035. Protection of certain employee retirement benefits. Maintenance of substantially comparable employee compensation and benefits for 3 years. Retention payments to all full-time employees of 100% current base compensation, and commitment to new headquarters and employees in downtown Jacksonville. Number 3, there shall be no base rate changes for any customers during the period of any competitive solicitation process. Number 4, JEA shall continue throughout any competitive solicitation process to operate in the financially responsible manner investors and rating agencies have come to expect and in accordance with JEA's core values. This resolution shall be effective immediately upon its adoption. Resolution 2019-08. A resolution approving the request for introduction of pension revision legislation to the City Council under Scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response, and authorizing the CEO to take any and all action to pursue the introduction of the legislation. Whereas the Board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to introduce pension revision legislation to the City Council of the City of Jacksonville in substantially the form attached hereto as Exhibit 1, the pension legislation. Whereas such legislation may require collective bargaining for certain employees. And whereas the Board has reviewed the pension legislation. Be it resolved by the Board that, number 1, the Board authorizes the request for introduction of the pension legislation in consultation with the Office of General Counsel, the Chief Executive Officer, and Managing Director, the CEO, or his designee shall have the authority to make technical and clerical amendments to the pension legislation, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the pension legislation. And the CEO or his designee shall have authority to take or cause to be taken any and all action and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered, any and all documents that the CEO or his designee deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. Number 2, this resolution shall be effective immediately upon its adoption. Resolution 2019-09. A resolution approving Employee Protection and Retention Program and approving CEO and non-CEO executive employment agreements under Scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response, and authorizing action to pursue implementation of such program and execution of such agreements. Whereas the Board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to adopt an Employee Protection and Retention Program in connection with investigation and pursuit of Scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response. Whereas the Board has reviewed the summary of the terms and conditions of the Employee Protection and Retention Program attached hereto as Exhibit 1, the Employee Protection and Retention Summary. Whereas such Employee Protection and Retention Program may require collective bargaining for certain represented employees. Whereas the Board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to retain the talent necessary to effectively implement Scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response, and to enter into employment agreements with employees of JEA that have a title of Vice President or higher. And whereas the Board has reviewed the employment agreement with JEA's Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director, the CEO, attached hereto is Exhibit 2, the CEO Employment Agreement, and the employment agreement with JEA's Senior Executive Management Team other than the CEO, in substantially the form attached hereto is Exhibit 3, the Form Non-CEO Executive Employment Agreement. Be it resolved by the Board that, number 1, the CEO or his designee shall have the authority to execute with each full-time employee who is actively employed with JEA on the date hereof, or is otherwise recommended by the CEO and approved by the Chair of the Compensation Committee, an Employee Protection and Retention Program Agreement, the Form Employee Protection and Retention Program Agreement, on the terms and conditions set forth on the Employee Protection and Retention Summary, to take or cause to be taken any and all action, and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered, any and all documents that the CEO or his designee deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. Number 2, the CEO or his designee shall have the authority to, in consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the Form Employee Protection and Retention Program Agreement, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the Form Employee Protection and Retention Program Agreement. Number 3, the Board hereby approves the CEO Employment Agreement and Form Non-CEO Executive Employment Agreement. Number 4, the Chair of the Board shall have the authority to execute the CEO Employment Agreement, in consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the CEO Employment Agreement, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the CEO Employment Agreement, and take or cause to be taken any and all action, and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered any and all documents that the Chair of the Board deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. Number 5, the CEO or his designee shall have the authority to execute non-CEO executive employment agreements in substantially the same form as the form non-CEO executive employment agreement. In consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the non-CEO executive employment agreements, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the non-CEO executive employment agreement, and take or cause to be taken any and all action, and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered any and all documents that the CEO or his designee deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. Number 6, this resolution shall be effective immediately upon its adoption.
Thank you. I think it's important that we, as intensive as that was, I think it's important that everybody understand the specifics of the resolutions. Before I open it up to discussion, I would like to thank each board member. Each board member has taken an extensive amount of time to research every document. It's my understanding even some board members were calling page by page and word by word, making sure that we thoroughly understood what was going to be presented today, and given the opportunity by each of the senior leadership team to really allow us to badger them and ask as many questions as we wanted. Some may have seemed redundant, but they were willing and very forthcoming in answering those questions. Personally, as I spent time reviewing the documents, I started to feel as though some of the scenarios were playing out, it felt very corporate. You know, to say unprecedented in terms of scenario 3 being presented, it felt very corporate. And I kept trying to come back to, we are a municipal, community-owned utility. So are we, as we think about scenario 3, or we think about the detriment of a traditional response, are we really staying focused to what's important? And I think it was said numerous times today, and what's important and what has to be our priority are our employees, our ratepayers, and the community, the environment. So that I did feel throughout this entire presentation. So as I open this up to discussion to the rest of the board members, I think all of us were here in 2017 when previous board member Petway presented that JEA should be evaluated, or evaluated as that word was thrown away, on the idea of privatizing or non-government to transitioning to a non-government. And what this felt different from that moment was the time and the research to even figure out if that is something we should pursue. I think it was just thrown on the table and the work had not been done. So I would open the discussion from the board members. Andy, I know that you were not here, but I would love to hear how each of you felt as you pursued through this, and make sure that we've come to this moment in the timeline to make the best decision. I'll start to my left with you, Andy.
Sure. Thank you. Obviously, I'm the newest board member, and I'm drinking from the fire hose right now, and I've learned so many acronyms just in the past couple of months that I feel like I'm eating alphabet soup. But to echo what Madam Chair said, and obviously Ryan and also other employees and union members and whatnot, we need to be watching out first and foremost for the employees. As I was reading through this, you know, called it the JEA Bible. It was a lot of time, energy, and effort, and I'm honored to do so. I kept coming back to CSEF, and frankly, when Mr. Zahn said CSEF in our last board meeting, I literally thought to myself, what the heck is that? And obviously, once I looked at the slide, I understood that there's an acronym for our 4 values, which are customer, community impact, environmental, and financial. Frankly, with employees being our biggest asset, I thought the E in that was actually employees, and then obviously I've learned that they follow under the community, since they are our community and our community are our employees. But I wanted to know, where did this come from? Because as we're looking at these scenarios, we have to have, as one of the employees and union leaders said, a grading scale, because they're based off grading scale. And so I looked back arduously through 14 or 15 board meeting agendas and had numerous discussions. I was the one that called probably way too much and had a lot of questions. But I wanted to just make sure that I'm understanding from my own personal perspective as we look through these scenarios, what exactly is CSEF and where did it come from? So what I found out through a lot of discussion is that last May, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is obviously selfishly myself trying to understand and wrap my hands around this. Last May, interim CEO Mr. Zahn, he interviewed city council members, senior leadership team, board of directors on how to measure the value of JEA. One of the greatest quotes my business partner tells me all the time is, "You can't manage if you can't measure." I thought it was his quote, but it was actually Peter Drucker's quote as I looked it up. And so where this led to is June 2008, the board of directors helped develop the shareholder framework document, which incorporated CSEF, which are our values. How do we measure success? Through July and the August board agendas, I've learned that the board reviewed and finalized in August 2008 and also sent to city council, not for approval, but just for their own sake, which actually coincided that city council passed in August the subcommittee report on the future of JEA. So there was probably a lot of weigh in there. And in September, sorry, I got a bunch of notes. In September through January, the guiding principle documents, there was a weigh-in from 2,000 employees, everyone here at JEA, who took, I'm assuming, questionnaires or surveys or whatnot, union leaders, and obviously set new vision and mission based off CSEF, their core competencies and everything else. But that was approved in 2019 by the board, correct? Right. So January and February, JEA engaged a third party, McKinsey, to help with a 10-year strategic plan to increase value based on CSEF. We need to have a grading scale, community, impact, customers, environmental, and financial values. And they helped implement and put together a scenario-based strategic planning. We learned where are we now in May. I wasn't at the meeting, but I obviously read the agenda, consent agenda from last board meeting, that we're at status quo. And thanks to the Energy Policy Act of 2005, while our sales are down and rates are up, we are handcuffed and constrained from getting into other revenue streams for the fact that we're a government municipality. So the board directed we need to have a traditional utility response on how we're going to answer this. So then my first board meeting, which was once again drinking from the fire hose, we asked them to finalize implementation traditionally and then come back with alternatives for traditional response while eliminating these constraints. And so obviously they've came back with that and some other alternatives. And so when I'm reading through these scenarios, being new to the board, I have to look at, because this has already been predetermined and established, what's the grading scale? Grading scale is CSEF, in my opinion, and that's what we have adopted. So these three scenarios, I mean, they're tough, and I got to say, you guys did a heck of a lot of work and unbelievable, and just in the past month and then the month before that. So hats off to everyone that was included in that. But going back to now the scenarios in itself, we looked at scenario 2A, and I liked what Mr. Howard's comment was that, you know, how much of this is assumptive based off of where are we going if we do a traditional response. And, you know, put together the plan as best as possible with industry leaders and senior leadership team and whatnot. And I think that obviously, first and foremost, the headcount reduction, in my opinion, is you know, the thing that hurts worse. But back to the fact that it was assumptive. And then we go to 2B, and the probability factor of getting all of this legislation passed is slim to none. Some of them acts of God, if you ask me. And so, once again, look back at the chart, and I don't know which chart it was, but headcount reduction right off the bat, first move. And then we get to scenario 3, and I think, okay, I'm grading this off of CSEF, and it's hitting all the value metrics. It's taking out in my opinion, some probability and assumptions because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what's going to come back. And so that was kind of my summary of a couple of sheets of notepads of when I went through this of what it looked like. And I'm open for more discussion.
Mr. Howard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this board and our community find themselves at a historic moment. And as with many moments in history that later turn out to be of great significance, you can look back and see that had you been paying attention, you would have seen the historic moment coming. We talked earlier during Ms. Dyke's presentation about the impact of the EPA in 2005 and the impacts of the recession on 2007 and since on the utility industry and JEA specifically. I think a good student of utility history would say that the moment we find ourselves at now was predictable. Our industry and JEA in particular faces a high capital cost burden, generally a high debt burden, and certainly a high expectation of customer service. And in our case at JEA, an expectation from the city of Jacksonville that we'll make a significant financial contribution. When you combine those factors with the rapid technological change that our industry is facing, you get a recipe not for disaster, but for opportunistic change. I've listened to the presentations from staff, and I didn't have an opportunity when you concluded, Mr. Wanamaker, but as with Ms. Dykes and Mr. Vineyard, I appreciate all the work that went into your presentation today. Very thorough, very detailed. We have had a long community discussion around this issue over the last 2 years, with various stakeholders and constituencies weighing in with their opinions on what should be the future of JEA. I agree with the presenters today and with my fellow board member, Mr. Allen, that we need to be focused on our goals for JEA, our customers, our community, and our employees. I don't think our goals have changed, but it seems like the goalposts have been moved on us. And so we are now in a time where we need to make some dramatic changes to catch up to those goalposts. I think it's our fiduciary duty as directors of JEA to have these discussions and investigate these options. We have other utilities in Florida and around the country where the boards and management are just sticking their heads in the sand and hoping this problem will solve itself. I believe that JEA has a long tradition of foresight, being out ahead of the industry on a number of initiatives, and this is just the latest. I believe that we have a duty at this board to make the right decision for the future of JEA, its employees, customers, and the community. I do not believe that scenario 2A or 2B adequately meet those challenges and serve those goals. While we could sit back and allow JEA to shrink, either by atrophy and attrition or by active curtailment of our employees, and hope that revenues catch up or that we find new technological solutions to our challenges, I think that we would be remiss in our duty if we were to do so. I support the initiative of scenario 3. I believe it's incumbent upon us to find a way to protect our employees, customers, and community by seeking a pro-growth initiative. I'm satisfied by the answers I've received from Ms. Dykes, Mr. Wanamaker, and the other members of the senior leadership team that management has fully explored all opportunities for revenue growth, made their best assumptions as to the forecast in the future, have operated at near peak efficiency on management of expenses, and that scenario 2 and traditional responses would not get us where we want to be, even if we were successful in overcoming some of the high hurdles that we face in the Florida Constitution, statutes, city charter, and public policy challenges. So with that, I believe that this board needs to move forward with scenario 3. This is not a decision to sell JEA. It's a decision to explore opportunities for growth. Any other decision would have to come back to this board, have to go to city council, and if it involved a disposition of assets, it would go to the citizens of Jacksonville. So I don't want anyone to, media or otherwise, to be jumping to a conclusion that the JEA board today is voting to sell JEA. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about exploring options to grow and protect JEA from what would otherwise be a slow but certain death spiral. So I have a lot of questions. Those are sort of my preliminary comments. I'll yield to the other directors for general discussion, but I'd like to circle back and talk about some of the resolutions, the employment, long-term incentive plan, those items. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let's do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've said it several different times, but certainly want to say it again. Thank you to the senior leadership team for your diligence. This couldn't have been easy. Definitely the detail and the thoroughness in which you truly dug into solution sets and exhausted all of the options. It's appreciated, and it certainly shows in the packets and overview that we received. Last meeting, I said it very frankly, this is insane. To be in a scenario that we have seen coming at us, Board Member Howard put it a little bit more eloquently with being historic, and it certainly is. When we look at the variety of the scenarios and the sentiments, our fiduciary responsibility to the employees, and it was certainly expressed at the start of our meeting today, our customers, and the reflection back, and I appreciate Board Member Allen going and regrouping us, or recentering me at least on where we've come. These last 12 months, certainly for me in serving in this position, have been very eye-opening in understanding the progression of an organization that is priming itself for growth. And so as we look at how we want to structure ourselves, evaluate all the scenarios properly, we've been presented with a couple of scenarios in 2A and B that are not indicative of how we've spent the last 12 months of thinking of progressing the company. And so I'm certainly open to further discussion. I have questions as well, but in a very succinct nature, my perspective is that it's in the best interest to move forward with scenario 3. There's certainly a lot more to dig into under that, but the option of scenario A and B in reflecting over the last 12 months and in placing an emphasis on our responsibility as board members doesn't put us in that direction. If we're holding ourselves accountable to that and what we're responsible for, my perspective is that scenario 3 certainly takes us down that better path. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Newbill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not that my dear friend Tom Pett would need defending, but when his last meeting, I think this is what he had in mind. It was taken out of context, and we went down a road that no one really stated at the time. We never talked about selling JEA. It got out of context. And so I want to say that first. I think we are now where he asked us to be, because remember, he made the statement, but he was leaving. He had no power to carry it out. And so definitely it was not about selling JEA. You know, in my opinion, when you talk about the traditional response, whether it's 1 or 2, it's like writing your own obituary. Mm-mm. You know you're going to die. But it seemed that...
Not if you're the Rolling Stones.
first thing that happens in a negative way is it's a negative impact on the employees who we're talking about making sure they're protected. And so definitely it's not something that that I'm looking at. The other part of it is we can see where we are now, where the traditional response leads to. For the past 10, 11 years, JEA hasn't been making money on the electric side. And so, we were in pretty good shape then, but it has constantly been on a downhill spiral. And so it's not going to get any better because technology is rapidly moving. And so in order for us to move in a positive way, I mean, we have to do something. We have to do something other than what we've been doing. If you're in a boat and it's taking on water and you don't do anything, then you know the boat is going to sink. And so here we are, I think, been presented with, in my opinion, you all have done a Herculean job. I mean, this is material that is food for thought. It covers, in my opinion, those areas that we needed to hear about that we could not have presented ourselves or written ourselves. So I want to thank you all again for that. So, Madam Chair, in my opinion, as was stated, I think by the other board members, that we do need to move from here with some kind of decision. We're stuck as it is right now, but we have an opportunity to move in a positive way, I believe. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd echo the sentiments of my fellow board members in terms of appreciation for the staff and our consultants, all of the time and effort that they've put into this exercise, their availability to us, their responsiveness in taking us through all of the scenarios and understanding our questions, taking the time to answer them more than satisfactorily. I really enjoyed the discourse earlier in today's meeting around projections and forecasts because that's a lot of my professional life, and I do agree with the sentiment that it's very difficult to provide any guarantee over the accuracy of a forecast. But the true value of a projection or a forecast to me is that it enables us to envision where we could end up in the future while there is still time to pull the respective levers and change the course of the organization versus getting to our destination and merely reporting back on what happened. So it's for that reason that I'm similarly supportive of scenario 3 and revert to the chairman.
All right. Thank you so much. The senior leadership team has been thanked around the board around the table by everyone of the hard work that has been done. But I think we omit to forget that they were actually researching their own destinies. They're not only employees, they're also ratepayers. So I just wanted to extend thank you again. I'm sure it was not easy. And if you guys continue to stay at the table as we walk through any questions that we have going forward. I'm going to ask from a legal standpoint, it seems like we're all in the same place in terms of which direction, which scenario that we would like to flesh out. It appears that scenario 3, the non-traditional response, is where everyone is. Am I in agreement? Should we move forward with doing a motion to move forward with scenario 3, and then and open for discussion, and go through each resolution that supports scenario 3?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay. All right.
Madam Chair, I move that the board adopt resolution 2019-07.
Second that.
You ready for motion?
I moved it. He
Moved
seconded
it.
it.
Second.
All right, okay, good.
All righty. Any discussion specific to this resolution?
Mr. Allen? Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. So specifically with scenario 3 and the minimum requirements, and I'm referring back to the chart that was included in Mr. Wanamaker's presentation. I appreciate the breakout of the minimum requirements. Any recapitalization that we might want to consider in the future. Is it your intention that with the competitive solicitation instrument that you would include these minimum requirements?
Yes, sir.
But one of the other things, and I don't know that it needs to be amended or included in the minimum requirements, but we had sort of another significant event last week. We brought down the last of the vertical buildings at Northside Generating Station, a process that we started a couple of years ago while I was chair, and actually predated my service as chair with negotiations with our partner on that site, FP&L. I know that there is a valuable permit associated with the generation abilities at that site, but there's also a significant amount of surplus land. I would very much like to see that in any recapitalization event that included a disposition of assets, that we set aside that land and it not be included in any transaction. I just think that's a long-term valuable community asset. And if this process ends up taking us down the path of a recapitalization event involving a disposition of assets, my personal thought, defer to other members of the board, but I'd like to see that asset excluded. Not sure if it needs to be included in the minimum requirements, but I just think that has significant future value.
Okay.
Based on its location?
Yes.
Okay.
Adjacent to the port, and how big is that site? Several hundred acres.
2,000 acres.
2,000 acres, thank you. Not making any more dirt, so dirt's valuable. Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. That was sort of my question around the minimum requirements. How did we come up with these, by the way? I like this. I don't know who came up with the minimum requirements, but I feel like they address all of the CSEF values, yeah.
So the minimum requirements were deliberated by staff and also in consultation with McKinsey and other outside consultants. Certainly, the first and foremost was the contemplation that in a dramatic shift of a business, you need to deliver dramatic results, and certainly these minimum requirements as compared to the status quo are dramatically different. They're certainly binary choices.
And the 400 million's not rolled into the 3 billion. That's separate, right? The payment to
The
customers.
$400 million distribution to customers is above and beyond the $3 billion distribution to the city, correct?
I think that's an important component because from my perspective, the longtime customers of JEA have contributed to the value of JEA by being loyal paying customers for decades now. And while it may seem a modest per account payment, I think that's an important component to any recapitalization event that rewards the customer directly, not indirectly by benefit to the city.
The balance of them, so first and foremost was the principle of having a dramatic difference. The second was investigating different market comps and being able to determine relative to financial, customer, environmental, and community impact, how those may have happened in the past and in other industries.
And does Daryl believe that the 40 MGD by 2035, is Daryl out there? There he is. Is that achievable?
2 thumbs up.
Let the record reflect. 2 thumbs up. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Howard, is your recommendation that we add,
I don't know what the rest of the board feels about. That was just my personal thought. So if somebody wanted to proffer a motion to amend my motion, I'm not going to be opposed to it. It might be something that staff would prefer that they have as a, something to talk about with anyone that might be interested. Who knows if we're going down a path of disposition of assets? I don't know.
I think I would take that as a point of consideration that could be considered.
I'm fine
I'm
with
not
that.
sure if at this time putting it as part of a minimum requirement package would be, because you never know, especially for example, tech companies that might consider import-export capabilities as economic development engines for the city. That may be some part of a consideration that they might want to think about.
I'm fine with that. I just, I think it's a
Yes, very-
significant asset.
Yeah.
We agree.
Okay, go ahead.
Madam Chair, as it appears as though we need to make a decision between scenario 2 and scenario 3, there were some elements in the scenario 2 presentation that I thought were still valid and achievable within the scenario 3. Most notably, the comment to continue to pursue revenue generation initiatives within existing constraints.
Sure, absolutely.
Perhaps a friendly modification to the resolution for scenario 3 would be to clarify that we continue, that it's our intent to continue on those initiatives in this scenario as well.
Absolutely, thank you for that, and I think, I'll let you speak to that, Ms. Rhodey, but I think that's definitely possible.
Yes.
It should be.
Madam Chair, a motion can be made to amend, I might suggest number 4 in the resolution to add whatever language you think you want in there. And that motion can be made before the main motion is voted upon.
There was a note in the presentation that read, pursue revenue generation initiatives within existing constraints.
Was that a motion?
Yes,
I'll second the motion to amend.
Madam Chair, could we clarify where you would like the language inserted?
But that would be right here at number 4. If we could just probably
So shall it,
reword that. Shall that throughout any competitive process to operate in financial responsibilities, to pursue, as Ms. Flanagan, additional revenue initiatives against current constraints.
so after values, it will read, and to pursue revenue initiatives within current constraints.
Yes.
Question, Madam Chair. Are we talking about doing something different than we're already doing? A new plan for enhanced or expedited revenue, pursuit of new revenue initiatives? I guess I'm confused as to what the point in the presentation was too, and to Ms. Flanagan's amendment. Are we asking staff to accelerate?
the concern that I'm hopeful to address, and I'm open to the method or mechanic by which we address it, is that if we're choosing scenario 3, it seems as though we're saying we're against scenario 2, but there were elements presented in scenario 2 that I think we should still be actively continuing to pursue, and I want to ensure that a vote for scenario 3 is not misunderstood to be against that positive element within scenario 2.
So on the tab 15 in that presentation, it said pursue revenue generation initiatives within existing constraints, expand electrification, optimize real estate, launch a retail marketplace, and implement residential solar application fee. Is that what you're saying we should do? I want to understand the proposed amendment, I'm sorry.
I viewed that one key element of scenario 2 was that there are existing constraints that exist, and that we should continue to encourage management and the organization to pursue revenue generation initiatives that can lead to growth for the organization or offset the decline in revenues within those existing constraints.
I'm certainly in favor of the expanding electrification and optimizing real estate. I'm not so sure I want to embody in this amendment implementation of a solar application fee or some of the other initiatives. I'm comfortable with a direction of management to aggressively pursue simultaneously with scenario 3, increased revenue generation. I just didn't want to make sure, I wanted to make sure that we weren't approving all the bullet points in that.
Would it be helpful for me to get
yeah.
an update on where we are with each of those?
That'd be great.
I'd be happy to do that. On the electrification initiative, we have recently completed a study of the electrification opportunity within our service territory, and that study tees up the next level of incentives that we can offer to customers to continue to electrify, which should drive an increase in electric sales. So that is teed up and nearly ready to go in terms of implementation. We have already launched the real estate optimization project that was brought before the board several months ago. We received bids back for the Coggin property, which is Atlantic and Southside, last week or the week before. And we'll continue to work toward optimization of our real estate portfolio. The retail marketplace is a business plan that's under development. It's one that could add significant value for our customers. It's a relatively low revenue opportunity, but it's more of a customer satisfier. Working through the development of that business plan, and we should be able to launch that within the coming months. The solar, as you noted, the solar application fee is not without controversy. And one that if we're not sitting in scenario 2, I'm not sure sitting here today we would recommend the board implement necessarily, but we could continue to develop that as a potential alternative and flesh out the pros and cons for the board in the future.
I think one of the things that we could do as additional language would just say, pursue additional revenue growth opportunities within existing constraints subject to requisite board authorizations necessary to implement new programs, which would capture some of the fees and other things like that.
So this is.
I'd be
this is my
willing to
thought.
accept that language as a friendly amendment to the motion.
Would that work?
So my thought is that we want to make sure that we're continuing, if we vote on scenario 3 today, that we are not forgetting that there are opportunities that exist today that we can pursue, right? But if we go down that path, does that open us up to, then we need to have in a language that says we continue to look for ways to cut costs and make sure that we're running the business? Thoughts on that we're kind of opening ourselves up to say, we're going to continue to maximize profitability, revenue opportunities. Then we also need to have a language that says we're going to continue to look for selling off assets to reduce our liabilities. Any thoughts back?
Madam Chair, I don't know that you need to say that because the existing language in the resolution says in 4, JEA shall continue throughout any competitive solicitation process to operate in the financially responsible manner investors and ratings agencies have come to expect in accordance with JEA's core values.
Okay, yeah.
I'm comfortable with that, tagging on the language that Mr. Zahn articulated as a friendly amendment.
Okay.
Madam Chair, there's a proposed amendment to Section 4, which has been seconded, that reads, JEA shall continue throughout any competitive solicitation process to operate in a financially responsible manner investors and rating agencies have come to expect and in accordance with JEA's core values and to pursue revenue initiatives within current constraints. That is the motion on the table.
And are we comfortable with that language, or do we want to revise it to Mr. Zahn's articulation?
I think it's fine.
I think everyone is in agreement that that is fine.
So there needs to be a vote on that amendment.
All in favor?
Aye.
Those that oppose, do the same. All right, the motion to amend number 4 of resolution 2019-07 has been approved.
And Madam Chair, there is now still a motion
Correct.
on the table regarding resolution 2019-07 as amended now.
If there are no further questions or discussion, can I please get a motion for resolution 2019-07?
Second.
That was already moved and seconded, so we didn't need a motion. Yeah, it was already, yeah, so it's on, I guess any other discussion would be.
Thank you. Any other discussion? No. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, do the same. Okay, resolution 2019-07 has been approved. The next resolution that we need to address.
Yes, Madam Chair, it's 2019-08.
All right, can we get a motion to approve resolution 20-1908? This resolution is approving the request for the introduction of pension revision legislation to the City Council under Scenario 3. which is the non-traditional utility response, and authorizing the CEO to take any and all action to pursue the introduction of legislation.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussions?
Why do you always look at me? Yes, I have discussion questions.
Of course you do.
Yes, sir.
I'll look this way first.
Many thanks to Mr. Vineyard and Mr. Hyde for the draft resolution, or OGC, whoever did it. I just want to be clear, because the presentation, I kept waiting for it. It finally came right at the end. The presentation protects employees' pensions by, and you had the neat little example of Frank and Caitlin, locking in pension benefits, but only upon a recapitalization event as drafted in the language, so the proposed language of the ordinance. So I want to make sure that everyone on the board understands that this proposed revision to the pension system for JEA employees only gets triggered upon a recapitalization event of the nature discussed in scenario 3. Correct.
Yeah, through the chair to Board Member Howard, that is correct. And the reason being for that is there is a funding mechanism required to protect the pensions, which the proceeds would only be available in the event of a recapitalization event. So that is the reason for the language. I believe it's section 3 at the very end, that it's recapitalization is the triggering event for this to occur.
Madam Chair, I support the resolution as indicated by my second, because I think if we're going to engage in a discussion under scenario 3, it's important that the employees have the comfort of the knowledge that this board has taken the action necessary to pursue protection of their pension, acknowledging it still needs to go to City Council, but that if this is something we're going to engage in a discussion about, they shouldn't have to live with the cloud of uncertainty regarding the safety of their retirement.
I agree. Any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, do the same. So moved.
Madam Chair, the next resolution is 2019-09.
And that resolution reads, a resolution approving employee protection and retention program and approving CEO and non-CEO executive employment agreements under scenario 3, the non-traditional utility response, and authorizing action to pursue implementation of such program and execution of such agreements. Can I get a motion to move forward with resolution 2019-09?
So moved.
Any questions or discussion? I purposely looked that way first. Mr. Howard?
Okay, thank you, if you insist. So 2 big components here that I want to make sure the board's had an opportunity to really thoroughly review and discuss. One is the executive employment agreements for both the CEO and non-CEO executives. And then the second is, are we being asked to approve the long-term incentive plan?
Not in this resolution.
Comes next, okay. So for the CEO employment agreement, and I apologize if I missed a compensation committee meeting. Was this approved by the compensation committee and is being brought as a recommendation from the compensation committee?
Well, as chair of the comp committee, I have had several meetings with Mr. Zahn and also with counsel with Ms. Rhodey to go through the specifics and make sure that we're in line with what we would like to go and put in place today.
So,
But it was not specifically at the comp committee meeting.
okay, thank you. So, Madam Chair, I know that there was some work done by our outside consultant, Towers Watson, and I don't know if John's available, if we have this information readily available, that showed where our executives rank in terms of the industry for compensation purposes. Is that readily available?
Yeah.
It is. Actually, if you have diligent, you could reference back the June 25th meeting where that presentation was presented. Would you like me to answer questions specifically related to that?
I'd like Latrice to show me how to get to June 27th. Yeah, it didn't walk from the other. So the importance of that is, I believe with this employment agreement, the board would be making Mr. Zahn the highest paid public employee in the city of Jacksonville. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but I'd like to for the board to have the benefit of being reminded of where our executive employees rank in terms of industry compensation. My recollection, if you have it in front of you, my recollection is that this would not put us anywhere near the top of compensation. And maybe you have it.
For myself, this would put me well in the lowest 25th percentile related to industry comparables in terms of compensation. And from a senior executives, we did not alter, even though their employment agreements are there, we did not alter their actual salaries. So that effectively leaves senior management in a position which is roughly in the 25th percentile related to base comp, and then I believe it's well over 40+% below industry average related to total compensation.
Thank you. That helps refresh my recollection, even though I couldn't get the diligent thing to work.
Refresh my recollection. Is that comparable to municipal or?
That includes all public as well as IOU and local comparables.
Yes, I have it. Thank you, Latrice.
For reference, the base salary in my employment agreement is exactly the same as the one in the prior CEO's agreement.
Thank you. Also helpful. And I'm sorry, confirming, you said we're not making any changes to current compensation levels for the other members of the
Correct.
SLT.
Correct.
And you haven't had a contract since you got here, right?
I have not, as I told the chair and the board, my intent was to take care of all of my employees before taking care of myself.
Okay.
Madam Chair, so is this retroactive?
I don't believe we are asking for retroactive as of today.
Well,
Well,
it
It's-
would be based off of, what was it, the May meeting, March meeting? That board member Newbill had requested that we at least honor that.
So this will be retroactive back to November 27th?
And
Yes.
it
This
is
year.
stated in the contract in itself.
Okay.
Oh, there it is. It's 1/1, I think. So it would be retroactive, time period beginning November 27th, 2018.
Yeah, I've got that.
That's
Well, that answers that.
section 1-1.
1-1, yeah.
Okay. Any further discussion?
By the way, Latrice helped me, and yes, the Towers-Watson study shows that for the CEO, the target variance for total compensation is 42% below the industry average. So, thank you.
Both municipal and IOUs.
Yes, I believe that's on a consolidated basis.
Any further discussion?
Madam Chair, I would just like to ask Aaron, how do you feel about that?
So, as a matter of policy, I think it's interesting that the Board of Directors of JEA in January amended the board policy recommending that total compensation for all employees be modified to the 50th percentile in the market. That being said, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of exploring all the strategic future of JEA. I also like to be one that delivers results before asking for things. And so I believe that this is a step in the right direction, and that as we move forward, and hopefully can deliver on some of those minimum table stakes, which are dramatic shifts from the current position of JEA that the board would see fit to recognize not only mine but the senior leadership and all 2,000 employees related to the performance necessary to deliver those. So as of today, I'm great. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. All in favor of Resolution 2019-09, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, do the same. Resolution 2019 has been approved.
And that includes the Employee Protection and Retention Program.
Yeah, as I read.
Yeah,
The
I just wanted to
resolution.
confirm.
Okay.
For
Yes, it does.
Okay.
That was non-controversial.
No, of course not.
Get another resolution?
No,
Not at this point.
Okay. All right. So as we move on the agenda, after, wow, that's a lot. But I want to reiterate, that we, as the board, have had the opportunity to review each and every document and ask, do all of the necessary research that the senior leadership team has, review the research that the senior leadership team has provided. And the comfort level in knowing that the employees was our first priority, then to follow with our community and in our environment gave us that level of, I think, everyone's confidence to move forward in this direction. So we'll move on with today's board meeting. The next, we have the total compensation employee benefits review by Chair Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and you're absolutely right. I feel like getting to this section is kind of, we've moved the boulder, right? Certainly addressing you again after having gone through and worked with management to develop the program. That's again in line with our strategy, guiding principles, and working with third-party consultant Towers Watson. I'm actually, just so everything can be transparent and clear, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Wanamaker to just kind of take us through, you popped up on me, to take us through the specifics of the performance unit program and certainly the long-term performance plan that Chair Howard wanted, or excuse me, not Chair Howard, Board Member Howard wanted to get into. So.
Actually, I'm going to, since I popped up,
Okay.
I'm going to.
All right,
And
Don.
so,
You
thank
take
you
it
for the
away. Thank you,
opportunity.
sir.
Madam
Absolutely.
Chair, members of the board, over the last several months, as Mr. Howard referred to, we've looked at total compensation, going back to January and even beyond. And you gave us some tasks to do to develop that program, and we have done so looking at base salary, looking at short-term incentives. The first few slides remind you of the core competencies that we helped to develop that, and the primary one is work together to elevate the entire team. And total compensation is a key driver in that effort. So to elevate the entire team, we had these four principles. Obviously, ensure that our compensation philosophy is aligned with our guiding principles, to encourage that long-term culture of value creation, then to establish a formal comp policy to align our behavior to the four corporate measures, the CSEF, and finally make sure it promotes collaboration to drive the vision and mission of JEA. So employee incentives should drive value and teamwork. As referred to previously, in January, you made a resolution or adopted a change to the board policy manual to address the comp program to direct us to come in line with the 50% of the market, and also a focus on long-term incentives. So we did a lot of that work and have now arrived at the long-term incentive. In June, you directed us to develop that program, and that's highlighted at the bottom of this slide as the final component of the program. So as we researched the feasibility of long-term incentives, we discovered several things, and it became apparent there was no definitive answer in Florida law regarding long-term incentives for government entities. So rather than become mired in discussions regarding whether something qualifies as compensation or not, whether it's subject to collective bargaining or not, we simply designed a program that's an employee benefit as opposed to a compensation program. And it provides employees an opportunity to purchase performance units and participate in the future growth of JEA. They will directly add value to JEA, obviously, as employees and in purchasing these performance units. And at this point, I will turn it over to Mr. Wanamaker to explain how the performance units work.
So what we're proposing is the adoption of a performance unit plan, which would be a new benefit program to enable employees to participate in both the upside and the downside as the business changes. So employees will be eligible to purchase performance units for $10 per unit, and the units will increase or decrease in value based on the financial performance of JEA over a 3-year period. Employees would be required to remain employed through the end of that performance period to receive any benefit from any increase in value. The first performance period would be fiscal years 2020 to 2022, and it's recommended that 30,000 performance units be made available for purchase. In your packet, you'll find a full summary of the details in this program, but I wanted to walk the board through some of the mechanics of how this would work for this first performance period. So the performance units would increase or decrease in value based upon the financial performance of JEA. And before employees would see any benefit from this program, JEA would be required to exceed a challenge target for value over the course of the performance period. So for the first performance period, this 3-year period, employees would need to increase the value of JEA by at least $300 million before they would receive any benefit. So between now and 2022, they'd have to exceed $300 million in increased value. If they increase value by more than that $300 million, they would be eligible to receive 10% of the value that's generated above $300 million. So for example, if employees increase the value of JEA by $600 million, which would represent a substantial increase of over 20% in the value of JEA over that 3-year period, these performance units would be eligible for 5% of the $600 million in value that was created. This would equal $30 million, or an average of about $10 million per year over that performance period. To put that in perspective, it represents a little more than 6% of our total annual payroll. On the flip side, if the value of JEA was less than it is today at the end of the performance period, the value of the performance units would decline in value, and employees would experience a loss at the end of the performance period. In the event that the employees increase the value of JEA, but it does not exceed the $300 million challenge, then they would receive no gain, they would experience no gain or loss, and would simply receive their money back at the end of the performance period. There's a resolution on this item, and so I'll turn it over to Ms. Rohde to read that now.
Madam Chair? Yes. This is Resolution 2019-10, a resolution approving long-term performance unit plan and related documentation and authorizing the CEO to take any and all action to pursue the implementation of such plan and related documentation. Whereas, in accordance with Board Policy 2.7, the Compensation Committee directed JEA Management in January 2019 to develop a compensation policy to align with talent market and guiding principles. JEA Management presented to the Compensation Committee, and the Compensation Committee approved in June 2019 the framework for a compensation plan, including a long-term incentive plan. Whereas, at its June 2019 board meeting, the board approved the framework of JEA's long-term compensation plan and authorized JEA Management to develop the plan and present it to the board at the July 2019 board meeting for final approval. Whereas the board believes that it is in the best interest of JEA to adopt a long-term performance unit plan in connection with annual performance reviews and general operation of JEA. And whereas the board has reviewed the summary of the terms and conditions of the long-term performance unit plan, which summary is attached here too as Exhibit 1, the long-term performance plan summary. Be it resolved by the board that, number one, the chief executive officer and managing director, the CEO, or his designee, shall have the authority to implement a long-term performance unit plan, the long-term performance unit plan, on the terms and conditions set forth on the long-term performance plan summary. Execute with each actively employed eligible full-time employee, any full-time JEA employee as otherwise recommended by the CEO and approved by the administrator of the long-term performance unit plan, and each actively employed eligible full-time attorney from the Office of the General Counsel, the City of Jacksonville, who's dedicated exclusively to JEA, an agreement under the long-term performance unit plan. In consultation with the Office of General Counsel, make technical and clerical amendments to the long-term performance unit plan and/or the form long-term performance agreement, all of which do not increase the financial obligations or liability of JEA under the long-term performance unit plan and/or the form long-term performance agreement, and take or cause to be taken any and all action and to prepare, execute, and deliver, or cause to be prepared, executed, and delivered any and all documents that the CEO or his designee deems necessary or advisable to carry out the intent of this resolution. Number two, the chair of the Compensation Committee of the Board be and hereby is appointed as the administrator of the long-term performance unit plan with full power and authority to administer the long-term performance unit plan in accordance with the terms therewith. 3. The 2019 redemption price schedule under the long-term performance unit plan for the performance units to be purchased by participants in January 2020, attached hereto as Exhibit 2, is hereby approved. Number 4, this resolution shall be effective immediately upon its adoption.
Thank you. John, thank you so much for coming in, picking up the ball, and jumping right in and bringing us here today. And thank you, Board Member Johnson, for all the work that you've done on the compensation, chairing the Compensation Committee. Can I get a motion to approve Resolution 2019-10?
Second.
Did I get a second? All right. Any discussion? Is this your last board meeting, or how
It is
many
my
more do you
last
have?
board meeting. Yes.
Is it really?
It is my last board meeting, yes. So, either John or Ryan. So what happens if JEA shrinks? Scenario 3 is unsuccessful and the value of the enterprise shrinks. It's worthless? Are we underwater?
So, again, to the extent that the value of JEA decreases as it shrinks, employees would experience a loss on their purchase of these performance units. And so, I mean, that they would decline in value.
Yeah. Okay. And they're not tradable, right? It doesn't say that, but you can't transfer, non-transfer.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What happens on termination of employment for any reason?
So if it's a termination, and I want to make sure I'm speaking correctly, so looking at Ms. Rhodey on this, but if it's a termination with cause, they would lose those performance units. To the extent that it is without cause, there's a different provision for that. Can you refresh me on that?
Yes, and
It's in the summary. Do they go back in the pool?
yes, sir.
If they're terminated with cause?
It doesn't say. It just says involuntary termination, but it doesn't say what happens to the units. If they don't get paid out because they're vested, do they go back into the pool is my question. I think they must.
I believe so.
Yeah. Yes, they would.
Okay,
They'd be returned back to the company.
right.
Yeah, they would not be. Are you asking if they'd be eligible to purchase by somebody else?
Yeah.
Yes.
They go back.
That's right. They
It
would. They
was
would
follow
be,
up to my non-transferable.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. All right, I think I understand how it works. And then there's accelerated vesting upon a recapitalization event.
Correct.
I thought I saw somewhere where it said there were 100,000 units. Is it 30,000 per performance period?
So the plan document contemplates a program However, the 30,000 is all that would be authorized under the current fiscal year performance period. So,
There might be subsequent periods where the plan's authorized for 100,000, you can issue another 10, 15.
correct.
The idea is that this is, absent the conversation of today, this is really a continuation of the conversation the board of directors has been having since January of 2019. And so it's a follow-up, presenting a plan that would effectively live in perpetuity on an annual basis, just as other plans.
Sure. And I assume that this has been passed on by OGC. I know we've got some legal constraints over statutory plans. Yes.
Yes,
no
sir.
issues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
Through the chair, Ryan, could you walk us through how at a macro level, the valuation will occur?
Yes. So there will be a threshold that's set at the end of the fiscal year based on our audited financial results. There will be a formula that's laid out in the program that is the combination of the net position of JEA from the balance sheet, the total of any city contribution over the last 12 months, as well as any distribution to customers over the last 12 months. And so that will be kind of that floor, if you will, that's indicated by the red bar there, that forecasted value. From there, there'll be a challenge target that's set above that, and that's the $300 million that I referenced in the presentation. And at the end of the performance period, we would do the same calculation with the same audited financial results to determine that value at the end of that performance period.
To be very clear, none of the metrics utilized are subjective. They are all audited financial numbers that are going to be verified by an independent auditor.
And if I can ask a follow-up, are there any implications of scenario 3 as passed today and how that interacts with this plan?
No, so the only implication, and Mr. Howard referenced it, would be that, if there is a transaction, a recapitalization event, the performance period would end at the closing of that recapitalization event. And so you would perform that calculation at that time.
Any further discussion?
It has the salutary effects of sort of a retention program during this time of uncertainty.
Sure.
All in favor of Resolution 2019-10, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those not in favor, do the same. So moved. Alrighty, next on the agenda is old business. Any old business to discuss? Any new business to discuss?
I'm leaving.
Yeah, I was gonna say new business. I just learned that you're leaving right now.
I can't say it's been fun always, but it's certainly been a pleasure. I've enjoyed working with each and every one of the members of this board, and it's been a privilege to represent the fine men and women who make up JEA. So I said my goodbyes when I stepped down as chair. I got my nice little vintage meter, so I won't prolong the agony. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Alrighty. Any open discussion, anything any board member would like to discuss? Now's our opportunity. And Mr. Zahn, Managing Director's report.
I would like to extend a sincere set of gratitude to Ms. Rohde, as well as the entire senior leadership team for all of the work that you reviewed. As the board knows, was produced over the last 3 to 4 weeks since the June board meeting. And many members of our team have worked countless hours, Mr. Hyde as well. I wagered to bet in excess of almost 100 hours a week getting ready for this board meeting. cannot thank them enough for the effort that they put into this and for the thoughtfulness. I also want to thank each one of the board members. It's been fun talking late at night and early in the morning. I have to imagine it'll continue, but I think as Mr. Howard recognized, this has the opportunity to be one of the most significant events for all of Northeast Florida, not just for our city, but for each person and stakeholder that is a part of our community, as well as what I commend the board on is in following through on the promise to take care of employees first, because employees take care of us and they take care of the customers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I would just reiterate what you've just said, Mr. Zahn. For myself, and as you've seen today, the most important thing was to ensure that our employees and our customers were priority. And through that work, I think that we've shown that today. I hope that the employees feel that we have done that. I also want to reiterate Mr. Howard today, and that I want to make sure that it is understood that we did not vote today to sell JEA. I think it's important that we say that. What we exactly did today, specifically what we did today, was we gave leadership direction to pursue an unconstrained, non-traditional response to make JEA better for the employees, for the community as a whole. And other than that, I think we can adjourn for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.